Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place between the stars where the laws of nature bend and break, where reality wears thin like old cloth stretched too far, and where the things that should not exist find room to breathe and fester and grow. It is a place so far removed from anything you might consider normal that even the bravest souls in the Imperium of man would rather face a charging orc warband than spend a single moment drifting through its depths. And somewhere in that endless dark, cutting through the void like a blade through rotten meat, there moves a ship. Not just any ship, not some gleaming cruiser of the Imperial Navy with its polished brass fittings and its cathedral spires and its tens of thousands of faithful crew whispering prayers to the God Emperor as they go about their duties. No, this is something else entirely. This is a plague voidship, a vessel of the Death Guard, a thing so thoroughly saturated with disease and corruption and the raw, unfiltered power of the chaos god Nurgle that it has become less a machine and more a living organism, a breathing, weeping, suppurating entity that drifts through the cosmos with the patience of a cancer and the inevitability of the grave. And tonight, we are going to spend a single night aboard one. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. When I say night, I am using the term loosely. There is no true night in the void of space. There is no sun to set, no horizon to swallow the light, no slow fade from gold to amber to purple to black that marks the passage of evening on a civilized world. Out here, between the stars, and there is only the cold and the dark and the endless nothing that stretches in every direction. But void ships, even the corrupted ones, still operate on cycles. They have to. The human mind, no matter how far it has fallen from the Emperor's light, still needs some kind of rhythm to anchor itself to. Some ships use the old Terran standard, a 24-hour cycle divided into watches and shifts. Others have adopted stranger measurements, cycles that correspond to the rotation of long-dead homeworlds or the arbitrary whims of whatever madman sits upon the command throne. And some, like the plague void ships of the Death Guard, follow a cycle that seems to pulse with something deeper and more primal, a rhythm that has nothing to do with the spinning of planets and everything to do with the slow, steady heartbeat of decay itself. So when the lumens dim and the great engines settle into their lower registers, when the constant hum of activity drops by just a fraction, and the corridors grow quieter in the way that corridors on a ship full of rotting things can grow quiet. That is what passes for night on a plague void ship. And that is where our story begins. To understand what it means to be aboard one of these vessels, you first need to understand what a plague void ship actually is. And to understand that, you need to go back to the beginning, back to the Horus heresy, back to the betrayal that shattered the Imperium and set the galaxy on fire. Back to the moment when the Death Guard Legion made the choice that would define them for the next 10,000 years and beyond. The Death Guard were the 14th Legion of the Emperor's Space Marines, and they were everything you would expect from warriors bearing that name. They were tough, they were relentless, they were stoic in the face of hardship and utterly unbreakable in battle. Under the command of their Primarch, Mortarion, they had carved a path of conquest across the stars during the Great Crusade, bringing world after world into compliance through sheer, grinding determination. They specialized in a kind of warfare that was not glamorous, not flashy, not the stuff of heroic ballads. They fought in the worst conditions imaginable, in toxic wastelands and poison-choked atmospheres, in the mud and the filth, and the endless grinding misery of attritional combat. And they excelled at it. They endured where other legions would have faltered, pressed forward where others would have retreated, and survived conditions that would have killed lesser warriors 100 times over. But when the War Master Horus turned against the Emperor and the galaxy erupted into civil war, the Death Guard followed their Primarch into rebellion. And it was during their journey to Terra, during the long voyage through the warp to join the siege of the Imperial Palace, that their true transformation began. Their fleet was becalmed, trapped in the Imperium by the treachery of their own first captain, Callus Typhon, who had secretly pledged himself to the Chaos God Nurgle long before the rest of the Legion had any idea what was happening. The ship sat motionless in that sea of raw psychic energy, unable to move, unable to escape, and one by one, a plague began to spread. Not just any plague, the Destroyer Plague, a disease so virulent, it's so impossibly lethal that even the legendary resilience of the Space Marines could not protect them. Their bodies, those magnificent engines of war that had been engineered to shrug off toxins and poisons and diseases that would kill an ordinary human in minutes, began to fail. Their guts bloated with corruption, their flesh distended and split, their organs turned to soup inside their power armor, and yet they could not die. That was the cruelest part. Their transhuman physiology, the very thing that made them superhuman, became their worst enemy. It kept them alive through agonies that no living thing should have been forced to endure, trapping them in bodies that were rotting from the inside out, while their minds remained aware of every excruciating moment. It was Mortarion who broke first. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he was the one who made the final, damning choice. Watching his sons suffer, watching the warriors he had led across the stars writhe in agony in the corridors of their own ships, he called out into the warp for salvation. And something answered. Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, the grandfather of plagues, the great and terrible god of disease and entropy and the slow, inevitable corruption of all living things, reached out and claimed the Death Guard as his own. The pain stopped. The dying stopped. But the disease did not. The Death Guard were transformed, body and soul, into something new. Something that was no longer quite human, no longer quite Astartes, but something else entirely. They became Plague Marines, and their ships, those proud vessels that had carried them across the galaxy in the Emperor's name, were transformed along with them. That is the origin of the Plague Voidships. That is where it all began. In the holds and corridors and engine rooms of those becalmed vessels, as the power of Nurgle seeped into every rivet and bulkhead and power conduit, as the metal itself began to corrode and weep and sprout with unnatural growths, the first plague ships were born. And in the 10,000 years since that terrible moment, the Death Guard have only added to their fleet. They have captured Imperial vessels and corrupted them. They have drawn derelict hulks from the warp and given them new, terrible purpose. They have bred ships in the way that a gardener breeds flowers, cultivating them with patience and care and a perverted kind of love until each vessel is a perfect expression of Nurgle's will, a floating garden of disease and decay that carries the plague god's blessings to every corner of the galaxy. Now, let us approach one. Picture yourself standing on the observation deck of an Imperial warship. Perhaps a cruiser of the line, 5 kilometers of plasteel and adamantium and sacred machinery, crewed by tens of thousands of loyal servants of the god Emperor. You are safe here, behind void shields and armored bulkheads, surrounded by the familiar hum of well-maintained engines and the soft chanting of the ship's choir as they sing hymns to the machine god. The void outside the reinforced viewing ports is dark and cold and empty, the stars burning in their ancient, indifferent patterns. And for a moment, everything seems almost peaceful. And then, on the very edge of sensor range, something appears. The auger arrays pick it up first, a contact that does not move the way a ship should move. It drifts, slowly and deliberately, like something that is not in any hurry, because it knows, with absolute certainty, that it has all the time in the world. The cogitators begin to process the incoming data, and what they return is wrong. The readings do not make sense. The mass is too great for the hull profile. The energy signatures are unlike anything in the ship's database. And there is something else, something that the machine spirits of the auger arrays seem reluctant to report, as if the very act of transmitting the information might invite contamination. It is a cloud, a vast churning, a seething cloud of something that surrounds the approaching vessel like a shroud. The sensors cannot identify its composition. because it keeps changing, shifting from one state to another in ways that defy the laws of chemistry and physics. One moment it registers as organic matter, the next as mineral particulate, and the next as something that the cogitators simply refuse to classify, marking it with error codes and warning runes that flash crimson across the control panels. That cloud is made of flies, billions upon billions of warp-spawned insects, each one carrying a payload of disease that would make an Imperial physician weep with despair. They swarm around the plague ship in a living barrier, buzzing and humming and feeding on the corruption that seeps from every crack and fissure in the vessel's hull. They are its first line of defense, these flies. They replace the turret arrays that once protected the ship from incoming torpedoes and attack craft, serving the same function through sheer, overwhelming numbers. Any fighter that attempts to make an attack run through that swarm will find its crew choking on insects that have somehow forced their way through sealed cockpits and pressure suits, its engines clogged with chitinous bodies, its weapon systems corroded by the acidic secretions that coat every wing and leg and mandible. But the cloud is just the beginning. As the ship draws closer and its outline begins to resolve through the murk of its own pestilent atmosphere, the true horror of the thing becomes apparent. This was once an Imperial vessel, yet you can still see the bones of its original architecture beneath the layers of corruption, the graceful lines of a Gothic hull design that spoke of the Mechanicum's finest craftsmanship. But those lines are distorted now, swollen and bulging in places where the metal has been pushed outward by internal growths that press against the hull like tumors beneath skin. The prow, which might once have borne a proud figurehead or a massive ram designed to split enemy vessels in two, is now a gaping maw of corroded metal, ringed with tooth-like protrusions of crystallized rust and what appear to be actual bone growths fused into the structure. Along the flanks, where once there would have been rows of macro cannon batteries and lance weapon arrays, there are now rows of pustules. Massive, as swollen blisters of diseased metal and organic matter that cling to the hull like barnacles on the keel of a sea vessel. They pulse with a slow, rhythmic contraction that suggests something biological, something alive, and periodically one of them will rupture with a wet, tearing sound that carries even through the vacuum of space, hurling a spray of corroded debris and infected matter out into the void. The ship's hull is not a single, uniform surface anymore. It is a patchwork of original metal, organic growth, and something in between, a biomechanical fusion that should not exist but does, held together not by engineering, but by the will of a god who delights in the corruption of all things. The color of the vessel is wrong too. Imperial ships, even the oldest and most battle-scarred, maintain a certain dignity in their appearance. Yet their hulls might be pitted and scorched and scarred from 1,000 engagements, but they are still recognizably metallic, still clearly the product of human hands and human ingenuity. This ship is green, not the green of paint or pigment, but the green of mold, of fungus, of the slime that grows on stone in places where the sun never reaches. It covers the hull in a living carpet that seems to breathe and shift in the light of the distant stars. And from certain angles, if you look closely enough, you can see things moving within it. Small things, crawling and squirming and burrowing through the organic matter that coats the ship like a second skin. And the smell, even through the sealed environment of your observation deck, even through layers of plasteel and void-hardened transparisteel and the atmospheric recyclers that are working overtime to scrub the air of any contamination, you can smell it. It is faint at first, just a suggestion of something wrong, like the ghost of a scent that your brain cannot quite identify. But it grows stronger as the plague ship draws closer, and soon it is unmistakable. It is the smell of decay, of organic matter breaking down into its component parts, of flesh rotting and fluids curdling, and the sweet sickly stench of death that has been going on for so long that it has become something almost alive in its own right. A presence that fills the nostrils and coats the back of the throat and makes the stomach clench with a nausea that has nothing to do with the physical body and everything to do with some deep, primal instinct that knows, on a level beyond conscious thought, that this smell means danger. That is what a plague voidship looks like from the outside. That is the first impression, the opening act, the overture before the opera of horror that awaits within. And already, we have not even stepped aboard. But we are going to, because that is what tonight is about. So let us cross the threshold. Let us pass through the outer hull, through the layers of corruption and organic growth and rusted metal, and enter the ship itself. And let us begin where every ship begins, at the top, at the bridge, at the place where whatever passes for command and control on a vessel dedicated to the Lord of Decay sits upon a throne of corroded metal and surveys its domain with eyes that have seen 10,000 years of war and pestilence and the slow, a beautiful ruin of everything the Imperium holds dear. The bridge of a plague voidship is not what you might expect, or perhaps it is exactly what you might expect, depending on how well you understand the nature of Nurgle and his servants. Because here is the thing about the Death Guard that many people fail to grasp. The thing that separates them from the shrieking madmen of Horn, or the scheming sorcerers of Tzinch, or the sensation-seeking degenerates of Slaanesh. The Death Guard are, at their core, still soldiers. They are still organized. They still follow a chain of command. They still plan their campaigns with the same methodical, grinding patience that defined them before their fall. The corruption has changed them. Yes, it has twisted their bodies and their souls and their understanding of what it means to be alive. But it has not destroyed the fundamental military discipline that was bred into them from the moment they were forged on the gene labs of Luna all those millennia ago. So the bridge still functions as a bridge. There is still a command throne at its center, elevated above the surrounding deck on a dais that might once have been marble, but is now something closer to calcite, a mineral deposit that has grown over the original surface, like a geological formation compressed into a few hundred years of warp-accelerated decay. There are still cogitator stations arranged in tiers around the central platform, their screens flickering with data that is part tactical readout and part something else, something that scrolls in symbols that no Imperial savant could read and no sane mind would want to. Or there are still crew members manning those stations, hunched over their consoles with a concentration that borders on devotion, their fingers moving across keypads that are slick with a film of organic residue that never quite dries and never quite comes clean. But everything is wrong. Everything is just slightly off from what it should be, like a familiar room seen through a fever dream, where the proportions are distorted and the colors are saturated and things that should be solid seem to waver at the edges of your vision. The walls of the bridge are covered in a layer of growth that looks like lichen but moves like muscle, contracting and relaxing in slow, rhythmic pulses that match the breathing of the ship itself. Pipes that once carried coolant or data cables now carry something thicker, something that moves through them with a visible peristaltic motion, and where they join the walls or floor, the metal has fused with the organic matter in a way that makes it impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. The air on the bridge is thick, not just with humidity, although there is plenty of that, a cloying tropical dampness that makes every surface slick with condensation and fills the lungs with a heaviness that makes breathing feel like work. No, it is thick with presence, with the sense of something vast and aware looking through the walls and the ceiling and the floor, watching everything that happens with a patient, benevolent interest that is somehow more terrifying than outright malice. This is the grandfather's gaze. This is what it feels like to be inside a space that Nurgle has claimed as his own, where every molecule of air carries a trace of his divine attention and every surface bears the mark of his affection. The command throne is occupied. It always is. The Chaos Lord who commands this vessel sits upon his seat of power with the stillness of a statue. his massive form encased in power armor that has long since ceased to be a separate entity from the flesh it was designed to protect. The armor has grown into him, or he has grown into the armor, and the distinction is meaningless now. Ceramite plates that were once the proud grey-green of the Death Guard are now a mottled patchwork of verdigris and rust and organic matter, shot through with veins of something that glows faintly with a sickly bioluminescence. His left pauldron is a garden of fungal growths, tiny mushrooms and molds in a dozen different colors sprouting from the cracks in the ceramite like wildflowers on a ruin. His right hand, the one that grips the arm of the throne with a casualness that belies the superhuman strength contained within it, is bare of gauntlet, and the flesh that is visible is grey and bloated. The skin split in places to reveal the yellowed fat beneath, and each wound crawls with tiny white larvae that he does not seem to notice or care about. His face. His face is the face of a warrior who has been fighting for longer than most civilizations have existed. It is broad and heavy-jawed, with features that might once have been handsome in the rough-hewn way of the sons of Barbarous, Mortarian's toxic homeworld. But the centuries have not been kind. The flesh has sagged and swollen. The eyes have sunk deep into their sockets behind lids that are perpetually half-closed. And the mouth, when it opens, reveals teeth that are cracked and blackened and set in gums that weep a slow, constant trickle of something that is not quite blood and not quite pus, but some unholy combination of the two. There are horns, small ones, barely visible beneath the matted, greasy hair that hangs around his face like a curtain, but they are there, curling upward from his temples in a way that suggests they have been growing for centuries and will continue to grow for centuries more. But his eyes, when they open fully, when they fix upon whatever has drawn his attention, they are sharp, they are clear. They are the eyes of a tactician, a strategist, as a warrior who has forgotten more about the art of void warfare than most Imperial admirals will ever learn. This is the contradiction at the heart of the Death Guard. They are rotting, they are diseased, they are corrupted beyond anything that the Imperium could consider redeemable. But they are not stupid, they are not mindless, they are 10,000 years old, many of them, and in those 10,000 years they have been fighting, thinking, planning, adapting. They have become something that the Imperium consistently underestimates. And that underestimation has cost the Emperor's servants dearly on more occasions than anyone cares to count. Around the command throne, the bridge crew goes about its business with an efficiency that would surprise anyone expecting the servants of chaos to be disorganized or incompetent. The helmsman, and a creature that might once have been human, but has been so thoroughly transformed by Nurgle's gifts that classification is a matter of debate, manipulates the ship's heading with fingers that have fused together into flipper-like appendages perfectly adapted for the slime-coated control surfaces. The auger operator, a hulking figure whose head has swollen to twice its normal size and whose single remaining eye has been replaced by a cluster of smaller orbs that swivel independently like those of a spider, reads the streams of data flowing across screens that are cracked and stained but still functional. The communications officer, recognizable as such only by her position at the Vox station, speaks in a voice that is equal parts human speech and the buzzing of insects, while relaying orders and receiving reports from the other vessels in the Plague Fleet. These are the mortal crew, the human beings who serve aboard the Plague ship, not the Death Guard themselves, who are far too few in number and far too valuable to waste on the mundane tasks of shipkeeping, but the thousands upon thousands of ordinary humans who have been pressed into service, willingly or otherwise, to keep the vessel running. Some of them are cultists, true believers who worship Nurgle with a fervor that borders on ecstasy, who see their diseases and mutations not as afflictions, but as blessings, gifts from a loving God who has chosen them for a special purpose. Others are slaves, captives taken from conquered worlds and put to work in the bowels of the ship, or their bodies slowly succumbing to the ambient corruption that permeates every surface and every breath of recycled air. And some are somewhere in between, people who were not willing participants in their own damnation, but who have, over time, come to accept their new existence with a resignation that is its own form of worship. The bridge is where the will of the Chaos Lord is translated into action, where the strategic decisions that will determine the fates of worlds are made with the same calm, deliberate patience that the Death Guard bring to everything they do. And on this night, as the lumens shift to their lower setting and the ship settles into whatever passes for its rest cycle, the bridge does not go silent. It never goes silent. The screens keep flickering, the crew keeps working, the Lord keeps watching. Because aboard a plague voidship, there is no such thing as truly standing down. The war never stops. The mission never ends. The plagues must be tended, the engines must be fed, the course must be maintained. And somewhere in the darkness of the warp, something is always hungry. But the bridge is just the beginning. It is the head of the beast, the brain that directs the body. To truly understand what it means to spend a night on a plague voidship, we need to go deeper. We need to leave the relative order of the command deck and venture into the arteries and veins of the ship itself, into the corridors and passageways that connect the bridge to the thousands of other chambers and compartments and holds that make up the bulk of this enormous, corrupted vessel. And that is where things start to get truly unsettling. Because the corridors of a plague voidship are alive. Not metaphorically. Not in the way that someone might say a building has personality or a ship has character. The corridors are literally, physically, biologically alive. The walls breathe. They expand and contract in a slow, rhythmic motion that is visible to the naked eye. A gentle pulsation that moves through the metal and organic matter in waves, like the peristaltic motion of a digestive tract. And that comparison is more apt than you might think, because in a very real sense, the corridors of a plague voidship are a digestive tract. They process things. They break things down. They absorb what is useful and excrete what is not. And anyone who walks through them is, whether they know it or not, being digested in slow motion. The floor is not flat. It might have been once, when this was a proper Imperial ship with proper Imperial deck plating. But those days are long gone. Now the floor is a surface that gives slightly underfoot, like walking on a mattress that has been soaked in something viscous and left to dry in the heat. In some places, the original deck plates are still visible beneath layers of grime and organic buildup, their Imperial aquilus and identification markings worn almost smooth by centuries of corrupted feet shuffling over them. In other places, the deck has been completely consumed by whatever is growing from below, replaced by a surface that is warm and slightly sticky and covered in a network of fine, thread-like filaments that look like the root system of some enormous, unseen plant. The walls are worse. Where the floor might still retain some semblance of its original structure, the walls have been almost entirely consumed by the organic growth that permeates the ship. Pipes and conduits that once ran in neat, organized bundles now bulge outward beneath sheaths of what looks like skin, pulsing with the movement of whatever fluids flow through them. In places, the growth has formed blisters, some as small as a fist, others as large as a man's torso, filled with cloudy fluid that sloshes audibly when the ship shifts in the warp currents. The blisters glow faintly, a pale yellow-green luminescence that provides most of the light in the corridor, casting everything in a sickly pallor that makes even the least corrupted surfaces look diseased. And the ceiling. Look up, if you dare, and you will see that the ceiling is festooned with hanging growths that dangle down like stalactites in a cave, dripping a slow, steady rain of condensation that falls with a soft patter onto the deck below. Some of these growths are simple, just accumulations of rust and biological matter that have built up over centuries of neglect. But others are more complex, more structured, more clearly the product of some kind of intelligence or design. They form patterns, spirals and loops, and branching networks that resemble nothing so much as a nervous system, and when you look at them closely, you can see tiny sparks of light traveling along their surfaces, jumping from node to node, in patterns that are almost but not quite random. The sounds in the corridor are a symphony of the grotesque. There is the constant underlying hum of the ship's engines, a deep bass vibration that you feel in your bones more than hear with your ears. But layered on top of that is a chorus of organic noises that never stops and never repeats. The wet, sucking sound of the walls breathing, the gentle pop of blisters forming and sometimes bursting, the scratch and scuttle of small things moving behind the walls, things that are too quick to see clearly, but that leave trails of slime on any surface they cross. The distant tolling of a bell somewhere deep in the ship, its notes distorted and deepened by the corrupted atmosphere, until they sound less like metal striking metal, and more like the heartbeat of something immeasurably vast. And beneath it all, so quiet that you might think you are imagining it, a sound like whispering, like thousands of voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing, or murmuring words in a language that your brain refuses to process, but that your gut understands on some primal, instinctive level. The temperature in the corridor fluctuates. Some sections are warm, almost uncomfortably so, with a humid heat that makes the air feel thick and heavy in the lungs. These are the sections where the organic growth is most active, where the ship's corrupted biology is working hardest, processing and transforming and creating. Other sections are cold, bitterly cold, with a damp chill that sinks into the bones and makes the fingers clumsy and the teeth chatter. These cold spots correspond to areas where the hull has been breached at some point in the ship's long history, where the void of space still seeps in through patches that have been sealed not with metal and welding, but with scar tissue, and thick knots of biological matter that keep the atmosphere in but cannot quite keep the cold out. And everywhere, on every surface, in every crack and crevice and corner, there is life. The corridor teems with it. Tiny organisms that look like a cross between insects and fungi crawl along the walls in organized processions, carrying fragments of material from one place to another in an endless, purposeful migration. Larger creatures, slug-like things the size of a man's forearm, ooze along the floor, leaving trails of mucus that glisten in the bioluminescent light. And in the shadows, in the places where the light does not quite reach, there are eyes. Small, bright, malicious eyes that watch from the darkness and blink when you look directly at them, and that belong to things that are neither wholly of this world nor wholly of the warp, but something in between, something that was born from the corruption that saturates this ship and that exists nowhere else, a unique form of life that would horrify any Imperial biologist and fascinate any Margos biologist of the Mechanicum, if either could survive long enough to study it. This is what the corridors of a plague void ship are like. This is what you walk through when you move from one section of the ship to another. This is the connective tissue, the in-between space, the transition zone that separates the various organs of this enormous, diseased body, and every step you take through it, every breath you draw of its thick, contaminated air, changes you, just a little, just enough. The spores that float invisibly in the atmosphere settle on your skin and begin their slow work of colonization. Yet the microorganisms in the moisture that coats every surface find their way into the tiny cuts and abrasions that everyone accumulates in the course of daily life. The whispers that hover just below the edge of hearing plant seeds in the fertile soil of your subconscious mind. You are being changed, just as the ship was changed, just as the Death Guard were changed. And the process is so gradual, so gentle, so almost imperceptible that by the time you realize what is happening, it is already too late. But we are not here to resist. We are here to observe. So let us keep walking. Let us follow these corridors deeper into the ship, past the bridge and the command deck, and the officers' quarters where the Chaos Lord and his lieutenants hold their endless councils of war, and down into the levels where the bulk of the ship's inhabitants live and work and pray, and slowly, inexorably rot. Let us go to the crew decks. The crew decks of a plague void ship occupy a vast section of the vessel's interior, stretching across multiple levels and encompassing hundreds of individual compartments, dormitories, mess halls, workshops, and gathering spaces. On an Imperial ship, these areas would be organized with military precision. each compartment assigned a specific function and maintained to a standard that, while rarely comfortable, was at least recognizable as an attempt at human habitation. On a plague voidship, things are different. The organization is still there, in a way. The Death Guard, for all their corruption, have not abandoned the concept of order. But the order has been filtered through 10,000 years of Nurgle's influence, and what has emerged is something that an Imperial observer would find deeply, fundamentally alien. Not because it is chaotic, but because it is organized along principles that no uncorrupted mind would consider rational. The mortal crew of a plague voidship numbers in the tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, depending on the size of the vessel. These are not all willing participants in their own damnation, although many of them are. The crew is drawn from a variety of sources, and understanding where they come from helps to understand the strange, layered society that exists aboard these corrupted vessels. At the top of the mortal hierarchy are the Nurgle cultists. These are the true believers, the men and women who have voluntarily given themselves to the plague god in exchange for his gifts. They are the priests and deacons of a faith that would make an Imperial confessor weep with horror, and they take their duties with absolute seriousness. They tend the ship's shrines. They lead the daily prayers and chanting sessions that echo through the corridors at regular intervals. They oversee the distribution of food and water, such as it is, and they serve as intermediaries between the mortal crew and the Death Guard themselves, translating the will of the Plague Marines into terms that ordinary humans can understand and obey. The cultists are generally in better physical condition than the rest of the crew, not because they are less diseased, but because their diseases tend to be more stable, more controlled, but more clearly the product of deliberate blessing rather than random contamination. They wear their afflictions with pride, displaying their boils and sores and mutations like medals earned in service to a beloved commander. Below the cultists are the pressed crew, the ordinary humans who have been captured from conquered worlds and put to work aboard the ship. These poor souls occupy the vast bulk of the crew decks, filling the dormitories and work gangs and labor details that keep the vessel functioning. Their condition varies enormously depending on how long they have been aboard and how much of Nurgle's corruption has taken root in their bodies. The newest arrivals, those taken in the most recent raids and planetfall operations, are often still recognizably human, still fighting the diseases that assault them from every direction. Still clinging to whatever faith or hope or simple stubborn refusal to die that keeps them putting one foot in front of the other. These newcomers are easy to spot on the crew decks. They are the ones who flinch when something crawls across their skin. They are the ones who still try to clean their quarters, still try to maintain some semblance of hygiene in an environment where hygiene is not just impossible, but almost blasphemous. They are the ones whose eyes still hold a spark of the person they used to be before the plague ship claimed them. The longer-serving crew members are a different story. After months or years of exposure to the ambient corruption that saturates every surface and every breath of air aboard the ship, they have been changed in ways that go beyond simple disease. Their bodies have adapted, in a sense, finding a new equilibrium with the plagues that infest them. They no longer suffer from their afflictions in the way that the newcomers do. The fevers have stabilized. The sores have stopped hurting. The mutations have settled into their final forms, and while those forms would make an Imperial physician reach for the nearest flamer, they are at least consistent. These veteran crew members move through the ship with a familiarity that borders on comfort, and some of them, the ones who have been aboard the longest, have come to a kind of peace with their situation. Not happiness exactly, but an acceptance that is perhaps the most insidious of all of Nurgle's gifts. They no longer rail against their fate. They no longer dream of rescue or escape. They simply exist, carrying out their duties with the same plodding, but mechanical determination that defines the Death Guard themselves. And in doing so, they have become something that is not quite human and not quite demon, but something uncomfortably in between. And then there are the poxwalkers. These are the ones who have gone beyond adaptation, beyond acceptance, beyond any state that could be called living in any meaningful sense of the word. The walking pox, one of Nurgle's most terrible diseases, has claimed them body and soul, transforming them into shambling, groaning things that are neither alive nor dead, but trapped in a permanent state of both. Their bodies have mutated beyond recognition, sprouting horns and tentacles and bony growths that echo the appearance of Nurgle's demonic servants, the plague bearers. Their minds are gone. As consumed by the infection that has colonized their nervous systems, leaving only a basic, animalistic drive to move, to feed, to spread the disease that animates them. They are herded into the lower levels of the crew decks, kept in pens and holding areas that are little more than open pits filled with a stew of biological waste and diseased flesh, and they are used as expendable shock troops when the ship makes planetfall, vomited out of the landing craft in rotting waves that overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer, nauseating numbers. The crew decks themselves are a study in corrupted domesticity. Imagine, if you can, a hab block in an imperial hive city, but one that has been sealed and left to fester for 1,000 years. The walls are coated in the same organic growth that covers the corridors, but here it has been allowed to develop more fully, forming thick mats of fungal material that serve as both insulation and a constant source of the spores that maintain the crew's ongoing transformation. The bunks, where they still exist, are little more than shelves cut into the walls, each one draped in fabric that has long since been colonized by mold and that gives off a faint, phosphorescent glow in the perpetual gloom. The mess halls, where the crew gathers to eat, serve food that no uncorrupted human could stomach. A gruel made from reconstituted organic matter that has been processed through the ship's biological systems, enriched, if that is the right word, with enzymes and bacteria that help to accelerate the crew's ongoing transformation. The water supply, such as it is, comes from condensation collected from the walls and ceiling of the ship, filtered through layers of biological material that remove the most immediately lethal contaminants, but leave behind a rich cocktail of microorganisms that would keep an imperial biologist busy cataloguing for a lifetime. The sound on the crew decks during the night cycle is something that stays with you. It is the sound of thousands of beings existing in various states of disease and decay, all packed into a space that was never designed to hold them, all breathing and coughing and moaning and whispering in the dark. The cultists chant, their voices rising and falling in patterns that are part prayer and part lullaby. The words meaningless to anyone who does not know the rites of Nurgle, but the rhythm oddly soothing, almost hypnotic. Yet the pressed crew shift and groan in their bunks, their diseased bodies finding new pains to report as the ship's gravity fluctuates and the temperature drops. And from the lower levels, from the pens where the poxwalkers are kept, there rises a constant, low-frequency moan that is part hunger and part misery and part something that might, if you listen to it long enough, sound almost like a song. But the crew decks are not our final destination. They are merely a way station, a glimpse into the vast, suffering mass of mortality that fills the belly of this corrupted vessel. To understand the true nature of a plague voidship, we need to visit the beings who give it purpose. We need to see the Death Guard themselves, the Plague Marines, the Sons of Mortarion, the warriors who have been fighting the long war for 10 millennia, and who show no sign of stopping, no sign of tiring, no sign of doing anything other than what they have always done, which is to march forward into the teeth of whatever the galaxy throws at them, and to keep marching until everything in front of them is dead or dying or wishing it were. The Plague Marine quarters are located in a section of the ship that is separated from the crew decks by a series of heavy blast doors and decontamination chambers. Not because the Death Guard are concerned about contamination from the mortal crew, which would be a bit like a bonfire worrying about being set alight by a match, but because the environment in the Plague Marine quarters is so saturated with concentrated Nurglite corruption that an unaugmented human would literally dissolve within minutes of exposure. The diseases that fill these chambers are not the diluted, ambient strains that permeate the rest of the ship. They are the pure, undiluted plagues of Grandfather Nurgle, cultivated and refined over millennia by warriors who have made the study of disease into an art form, and they are lethal to anything that does not carry the plague god's blessing in its very blood. Step through those blast doors, if you could survive the transition, and you would find yourself in a world that is both familiar and utterly alien. The Plague Marines live in something that approximates quarters. Each one has a space that is recognizably personal, a compartment or alcove that contains whatever possessions the warrior has accumulated over his centuries of service. But these are not the Spartan cells of loyalist space marines, stripped of everything but the essentials of war and worship. These are something else. They are gardens, small individual gardens of disease and decay, each one as unique as the warrior who tends it, each one a reflection of the Plague Marine's particular relationship with Nurgle and the specific blessings he has received. One warrior's quarters might be dominated by a single, enormous fungal growth that has taken root in the corner and spread across the ceiling in a canopy of grey-green caps and hanging filaments.
Now, before we go any deeper into this ship, I just want to take a quick second to share something personal. The Death Guard are one of those factions that I think get misunderstood a lot in the community. People write them off as the gross ones, the disgusting legion, and yeah, they absolutely are. But what makes them genuinely fascinating to me is the tragedy underneath all that rot. And these were loyal soldiers once. They followed their Primarch into hell because they trusted him, and that trust was used against them in the worst possible way. They didn't choose Nurgle. The Destroyer Plague broke them until there was nothing left to do but accept. And I think that is what makes them so much more unsettling than any of the other traitor legions. They're not angry like the World Eaters. They're not scheming like the Thousand Sons. They're just resigned. And that quiet acceptance of something so horrific is what keeps me coming back to their lore over and over again. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
The fungus produces spores that the warrior breathes in constantly. Spores that carry the specific strain of plague that he has been cultivating for the last 300 years, refining and perfecting through an endless cycle of infection and mutation and selection. The warrior sits beneath this canopy during his rest periods, his armor removed for the first time in weeks, his bloated, diseased body exposed to the concentrated atmosphere of his private garden, and he breathes deeply, savoring the spores the way an oenophile might savor the bouquet of a rare vintage. Another warrior's quarters are filled with jars, hundreds of them, lining shelves that have been carved into the organic walls, each one containing a sample of a different disease or biological agent. Some of the jars contain liquids that glow with bioluminescence, their contents still active after centuries of storage. As others hold dried samples, preserved fragments of infected tissue, or crystallized concentrations of particularly virulent pathogens. The warrior who lives here is a collector, a connoisseur of disease who takes the same pride in his collection that an imperial governor might take in his gallery of fine article. He labels each jar in a spidery, precise hand, using a notation system that is part low Gothic, part the Dark Tongue, and part something that is entirely his own invention. And he can tell you the history and provenance of every sample with the enthusiasm of a man who truly loves his work. A third warrior's space is almost bare, containing nothing but a simple pallet and a weapon rack, and a small altar dedicated to the grandfather. This warrior is one of the old ones, a veteran of the Horus heresy itself, and a space marine who can remember a time before the plague, before the corruption, before the 10,000 years of endless war. He does not need the comforts of a personalized garden, because he carries his garden within him, his body hosting a biome of diseases so ancient and so thoroughly integrated into his physiology that he has become a walking ecosystem, a one-man plague factory that produces new strains of infection with every breath and every step. He spends his rest periods in silence, his eyes closed, his massive body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, and anyone watching him might think he was sleeping. But he is not sleeping. He is listening. Listening to the diseases within him as they mutate and evolve and compete for dominance. Listening to the subtle symphony of biological warfare that plays out inside his own flesh. And occasionally, when a particularly interesting new strain emerges, he opens his eyes and smiles, a smile that splits the cracked grey skin of his face and reveals the rotting gums beneath. The Death Guard, contrary to what many might assume, do not spend all their time in isolation. During the rest cycles, the Plague Marines gather in common areas that serve as something between a mess hall, a war room, and a temple. These gathering spaces are the largest chambers in the Plague Marine section, and they are where the brotherhood that binds the Death Guard is most clearly visible. Because make no mistake, these warriors are brothers. Not in the genetic sense that all Space Marines share, although that bond is there too, or woven into their DNA by the gene seed of Mortarion that still replicates and evolves within their corrupted bodies. No, the brotherhood of the Death Guard is something deeper, something that has been forged in the fires of 10,000 years of shared suffering and shared purpose. They have endured together. They have fought together. They have been transformed together. And that shared transformation has created a bond that is, in its own way, as strong and as sacred as anything the Loyalist chapters hold dear. In these gathering spaces, the Plague Marines do something that would surprise most Imperial observers. They talk. They sit together, in groups of 3 or 5 or 7, the sacred number of Nurgle, and they talk about their campaigns, and their plagues, and their plans for the future. And they share stories of battles fought and worlds conquered, of particularly satisfying kills and particularly virulent diseases. They debate the finer points of plaguecraft with the same intensity that Imperial apothecaries might debate surgical techniques, arguing over the optimal incubation period for a given pathogen or the most effective vector for transmission across a planetary population. And sometimes, when the mood takes them, they simply sit in companionable silence, their diseased bodies radiating a warmth that has nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the contentment that comes from being among one's own kind. There is a word for what the Death Guard feel in these moments, and it is a word that most people would not associate with the servants of chaos. That word is family. Nurgle is called grandfather for a reason. His followers are his children, his grandchildren, his beloved family, and the relationships between them reflect that domestic paradigm in ways that are both touching and deeply disturbing. The older Plague Marines look after the newer ones, not with the harsh drill sergeant discipline of a Loyalist chapter, but with a kind of gruff paternal affection that is expressed through the sharing of diseases rather than the sharing of wisdom. To give a fellow Death Guard a particularly potent strain of plague is an act of generosity, a gift from one brother to another, and to receive such a gift is an honor that acknowledges the bond between them. The Nurglings help maintain this atmosphere of grotesque domesticity. These tiny, cackling demons are everywhere in the Plague Marine quarters, as scuttling along the walls and ceiling, nesting in the folds of discarded armor, playing in the puddles of biological fluid that collect in the low points of the deck. They are the pets, the mascots, the beloved little terrors of the Death Guard, and the Plague Marines treat them with an affection that is entirely unironic. They pick them up and cradle them, scratching behind their malformed ears while the Nurglings squeal with delight. They feed them scraps of diseased meat from the ship's stores. They give them names, ridiculous names that are at odds with the horrific appearance of the creatures themselves, and they talk to them in the same cooing, baby talk voice that a doting parent might use with a favored child. The Death Guard call the Nurglings little lords, and the title is not meant sarcastically. But in the hierarchy of Nurgle's household, even the smallest demon has a place and a purpose. And the Plague Marines respect that hierarchy with a sincerity that would be admirable if it were not so horrifying. But the rest cycle is not all fellowship and domestic bliss. The Death Guard are warriors, and even during their downtime, the business of war is never far from their minds. In the gathering spaces, tactical discussions are a constant undercurrent, plans being drawn up for future campaigns, intelligence being analyzed from intercepted Imperial communications, weaknesses being identified in the defenses of worlds that have been targeted for the next round of plague-bearing. The Death Guard approach warfare with the same patient, methodical determination that they bring to everything else. And their planning sessions can last for hours, days, even weeks, as every contingency is considered, every variable accounted for, every possible outcome analyzed with the cold, analytical precision of minds that have been waging war for longer than most imperial institutions have existed. And then there are the rituals. The Death Guard are devout in their worship of Nurgle, and their devotions take forms that would be unrecognizable to any imperial chaplain. They do not kneel and pray in the way that the servants of the Emperor pray. They do not recite litanies or sing hymns, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, they worship through the act of creation. They create plagues. They cultivate diseases. They tend their gardens of corruption with the same care and attention that a monk might tend a garden of herbs and flowers. And in doing so, they express their devotion to the Grandfather in the most direct and sincere way possible. Every new strain of disease is a prayer. Every successful infection is an offering. Every world that falls to plague is a cathedral raised in Nurgle's honor. Which brings us to the laboratories, the workshops, the forges of disease where the most dedicated servants of Nurgle practice their dark arts, and where the plagues that will be unleashed upon the galaxy are designed and tested and perfected. These are the domains of the biologus putrefiers and the foul blightspawn, the master alchemists and plague engineers of the Death Guard, and they are, without question, the most dangerous places on the entire ship. The laboratories of a plague voidship are located in a section of the vessel that is isolated from the rest of the ship by multiple layers of containment, not for the protection of the crew, who are already so saturated with disease that a little more makes no practical difference, but for the protection of the experiments themselves. The plagues being developed in these labs are sensitive, temperamental things, as delicate in their way as any creation of high art. And the biologus putrefiers who tend them will not tolerate any contamination that might compromise the purity of their work. Step through the final airlock and into the primary laboratory, and you enter a space that is equal parts cathedral, greenhouse, and abattoir. The chamber is enormous, and stretching upward through multiple decks that have been opened up and connected by a network of ramps and walkways and spiral staircases made from fused bone and corroded metal. The walls are lined with vats, hundreds of them, each one as tall as a man and twice as wide, made from a glass-like material that has been alchemically treated to resist corrosion and filled with liquids that range in color from pale, sickly yellow to deep, viscous green to a black so absolute that it seems to absorb the light around it. Each vat contains a different experiment, a different plague in a different stage of development, and the biologus putrefier who tends this lab can identify every single one by sight, smell, and the particular shade of bioluminescence that each one emits. The putrefier himself is a sight to behold. Even by the standards of the Death Guard, these specialists are thoroughly transformed. They have developed unique mutations, clusters of milky, lidless eyes that grow beneath their skin like cysts, each one capable of perceiving the progress of an infection at a molecular level. These oculobes, as they are called, allow the putrefier to watch a disease spread through a living body in real time, tracking the advance of bacteria and the response of the immune system with the precision of a microscope and the intuition of an artist. The putrefier moves through his laboratory with the confidence of a man who is completely in his element, checking instruments, adjusting temperatures, making notes on scrolls of mouldering parchment that are carried away by capering demonic scribes for filing in the ship's archives. But the instruments of the putrefier's trade are a fascinating mix of imperial technology and something far older, far stranger. There are microscopes and centrifuges and genetic sequencers that would be recognizable to any imperial scientist, although they have been modified in ways that would void their warranty and probably their blessing from the machine god. But alongside these familiar tools are devices that have no imperial equivalent, contraptions of bone and crystal and living tissue that serve purposes that can only be guessed at by anyone who has not spent centuries studying the art of plaguecraft. There are cauldrons that bubble with substances that change composition when observed. There are tubes of something that looks like blood, but that is actually a concentrated delivery medium for diseases so virulent that a single drop could depopulate a continent. There are racks of blight grenades, each one carefully filled with a specific pathogen and labeled with the putrefier's distinctive script, ready to be distributed to the plague marines when the next campaign begins. The test subjects are kept in the back of the laboratory, in a section that is mercifully dim and separated from the main workspace by a screen of hanging fungal curtains. Behind these curtains, in cages that were designed for something very different from their current purpose, are the living experiments. Some of them are human, captured from the last world the ship visited. Others are xenos, as specimens collected during encounters with alien species and preserved specifically for the unique challenge their alien biologies present to the putrefier's plagues. And some of them are something else entirely, creatures that have been so thoroughly transformed by the experimental diseases they have been subjected to that they no longer bear any resemblance to whatever they once were, living masses of infected flesh that twitch and pulse and grow in directions that have nothing to do with any natural biology. The putrefier checks on these subjects regularly, not out of any concern for their well-being, but because the data they provide is invaluable. Each subject represents a different experimental pathway, a different approach to the fundamental problem that drives all of the Death Guard's plaguecraft: how to create a disease that is virulent enough to overwhelm any immune system, adaptable enough to infect any species, and persistent enough to continue spreading long after the initial infection event. The putrefier observes, records, adjusts, and moves on, treating his subjects with the same dispassionate, professional interest that a vintner might show toward his grapes. They are a resource, nothing more. Their suffering is a data point. Their transformation is a result to be measured and analyzed and fed back into the endless cycle of experiment and refinement. The foul blight spawn works in an adjacent chamber, one that is smaller and more intensely focused on the production of specific biological weapons, where the putrefier is a researcher, an experimenter, a seeker of new knowledge. The blight spawn is a manufacturer, and a craftsman who takes the raw materials produced by the putrefier's research and transforms them into weapons of war. His workshop is dominated by a single, massive still, a contraption of corroded metal and organic tubes that processes raw biological matter into the concentrated slurry that fills the plague sprayers carried by the Death Guard's frontline troops. The still works continuously, day and night, producing a steady stream of weaponized disease that is stored in sealed containers and distributed throughout the ship's armory. The smell in this chamber is indescribable, a concentrated essence of every foul odor that the human nose is capable of detecting, layered on top of each other in combinations that produce entirely new categories of stench. The blight spawn, of course, finds it delightful. Together, the putrefier and the blight spawn represent the creative engine of the plague Voidship, the driving force behind the Death Guard's most fundamental mission. They are the ones who ensure that each new campaign brings new horrors to the enemies of Nurgle, new diseases that have never been seen before, new plagues that exploit weaknesses that no one knew existed. And during the night cycle, when the rest of the ship settles into its lower registers of activity, the laboratories are often the most active places on the entire vessel, because the work of creating disease never stops. It cannot stop. The plagues must be tended, the experiments must be monitored, the production lines must keep running. In the laboratories of a plague Voidship, every moment is a moment of creation, and every creation is an act of worship. But we have not yet seen the deepest parts of the ship. We have not yet descended into the levels that lie below the crew decks, below the plague marine quarters, below even the laboratories. We have not yet visited the holds, the vast, echoing, lightless spaces that form the belly of the beast, where the ship's most terrible weapons are stored, and where things that should not exist outside the warp move and breathe and wait for the day when they will be unleashed upon an unsuspecting galaxy. Let us go deeper still. The deep holds of a plague Voidship are the places that even the mortal crew avoids if they can. These are the levels where the ship's corruption is most complete, where the boundary between the material world and the warp has worn so thin that the two realities bleed into each other in ways that are visible to the naked eye. As the deck plates here are no longer metal, they have been entirely consumed by whatever organism has colonized the ship's lower levels, replaced by a surface that is warm and yielding and disturbingly organic, covered in a carpet of something that looks like moss, but that recoils slightly from the touch of an uncorrupted hand. The walls pulse with bioluminescence that shifts and changes in patterns that seem to respond to the presence of observers, brightening when someone enters a chamber and dimming when they leave, as if the ship itself is watching and reacting to the movement of its inhabitants. The demon engine bays are located on this level, and they are perhaps the most unsettling spaces on the entire vessel. A demon engine is exactly what it sounds like, a war machine that has been possessed by a demon of the warp, and its mechanical systems fused with immaterial essence to create a hybrid entity that is part vehicle, part weapon, and part living nightmare. The Death Guard employs several types of demon engine, each one designed for a specific battlefield role, and each one as thoroughly corrupted by Nurgle's influence as the Plague Marines who deploy them. The fetid bloat drones hang from racks in their bays like enormous, rotting fruit on a diseased tree. These hovering weapons platforms are among the most recognizable of the Death Guard's demon engines. Spherical bodies of corroded metal and organic matter suspended on turbines that whine and sputter with a sound like a swarm of flies, magnified 1,000-fold. Even in their resting state, the bloat drones are not entirely dormant. The demons that inhabit them are aware, if not fully conscious, and they twitch and shift on their racks, their weapon mounts tracking imaginary targets as the demonic intelligence within dreams of slaughter and decay. Approach one too closely and you might hear it, a low, buzzing whisper that seems to come from inside the machine's shell, a sound that is part mechanical vibration and part something that might, if you listened carefully enough, resolve itself into words. Words in a language that no human tongue was designed to speak. The myphitic blight haulers occupy an adjacent bay, their tracked forms crouching in the gloom like armored beasts awaiting the command to hunt. These demon engines are the Death Guard's answer to the Imperium's dreadnoughts, mobile weapon platforms that combine heavy firepower with the resilience that is the hallmark of Nurgle's servants. And their hulls are encrusted with the same organic growths that cover the rest of the ship. But here, the growths have formed into deliberate patterns, defensive ridges, and ablative layers of hardened biological matter that provide additional protection beyond the already formidable armor plating. The demons within these machines are older and more powerful than those that inhabit the bloat drones, and their presence is felt as a tangible weight in the air, a psychic pressure that pushes against the consciousness of anyone who enters the bay and makes the thoughts slow and the vision blur at the edges. And then there are the plague-burst crawlers, the siege tanks of the Death Guard, squatting in their bays like enormous, bloated toads. These vehicles are designed to lob shells of concentrated plague across a battlefield, an arc after arc of biological weaponry that bursts on impact and spreads its payload across a wide area, saturating the ground and the air and anything living within range with diseases that begin their work immediately on contact. The mortars that fire these shells are partially organic, their barrels lined with a membrane of living tissue that adds its own biological agents to every round fired, ensuring that each shot carries a unique and unpredictable cocktail of pathogens. In their bays, the crawlers sit motionless, their engines idling with a deep, rhythmic throbbing that sounds disturbingly like a heartbeat, their demon inhabitants sunk deep into whatever passes for sleep among the Neverborn. But the demon engines are not the only things that dwell in the deep holds. This is also the domain of the Nurglings, as the smallest and most numerous of Nurgle's daemonic servants, and their presence transforms the lower levels of the ship into something that is equal parts terrifying and absurd. Nurglings are tiny, barely a foot tall, with bodies that are miniature versions of Nurgle himself, pot-bellied, cheerful, covered in sores and boils and sprouting with tiny horns and tentacles. They are the children of the plague god, born from the internal corruption of great unclean ones and gifted with a boundless, manic energy that drives them to constant activity. They are everywhere in the deep holds, scampering along the walls, swinging from the hanging growths on the ceiling, splashing in the pools of biological fluid that collect in the low points of the deck. They fight among themselves constantly, squealing and biting and wrestling in tangles of diseased flesh that are somehow simultaneously revolting and endearing. They steal things, they hide things, they get into places they should not be and cause problems that are out of all proportion to their tiny size. The Death Guard tolerate the Nurglings with a patience that borders on affection. The Plague Marines view them much the same way that a family might view a particularly unruly but beloved pet. An annoyance, yes, but also a source of genuine amusement and even comfort. There is something about the Nurglings' relentless, cheerful destructiveness that appeals to the Death Guard's sensibility, a reminder that even in the depths of decay and disease, there is still a kind of life, a kind of energy, a kind of joy that refuses to be extinguished. The Nurglings are proof that Nurgle's philosophy is not purely about death and suffering, but about the cycle that encompasses both. The eternal rotation of decay and renewal, that is the fundamental truth of all existence. During the night cycle, the Nurglings are at their most active. When the rest of the ship quiets down, when the mortal crew retreats to their bunks, and the Plague Marines settle into their rest periods, the Nurglings come out in force, streaming through the corridors and compartments in chittering, giggling swarms that leave trails of slime and tiny footprints on every surface they cross. They play games that have no rules and no winners, chasing each other through the ship's ventilation system, racing along the exterior hull in the vacuum of space, staging elaborate battles in the puddles of biological fluid that collect beneath the demon engines. Their laughter, a high-pitched gurgling sound that is somehow audible even through the sealed compartments of the ship, is the soundtrack of the night cycle, a constant chaotic chorus that fills the darkness with a noise that is part music and part madness. In the deepest recesses of the holds, below even the demon engine bays and the Nurgling warrens, there are spaces that have no official purpose and no regular visitors. These are the forgotten places, the sections of the ship that have been abandoned for so long that even the Death Guard have lost track of what they contain. The organic growth here is older and more established than anywhere else on the vessel, forming structures of considerable complexity. Arches and columns and vaulted ceilings made entirely of living matter that pulse and shift in the dim bioluminescence. In some of these deep chambers, the growth has developed something that looks almost like intelligence, responding to stimuli in ways that suggest a rudimentary awareness, growing towards sources of heat and nutrients, recoiling from damage, and occasionally producing sounds that are eerily similar to speech. The ship's tech priests, or rather the corrupted equivalent thereof, the Dark Mechanicum adepts, who tend the vessel's mechanical systems, speak of these deep spaces with a mixture of reverence and unease. They believe that the ship's machine spirit, the artificial intelligence that once governed the vessel's systems, has not been destroyed by Nurgle's corruption, but transformed by it, merged with the organic growth that has consumed its physical components and evolved into something new, something that is part machine and part demon, and part something that has no name in any language. They leave offerings in the deep holds, components and fluids, and occasionally living sacrifices, and they claim to receive guidance in return, flickering visions and corrupted data streams that they interpret as instructions from the ship itself, the voice of a consciousness that has been growing and evolving in the darkness for 10,000 years. Whether this is true or merely the delusions of minds that have spent too long in proximity to warp corruption is a question that has no answer. But the deep holds are undeniably strange, even by the standards of a plague voidship, and the night cycle is when their strangeness is most pronounced. In the darkness, in the silence, in the deep, organic darkness below the demon engine bays, things move that have no name and no purpose that anyone can identify. Shapes form and dissolve in the bioluminescence. Sounds emerge from the walls that might be words, or might be nothing but the gurgling of biological processes that have been running unsupervised for millennia. And occasionally, very occasionally, something that was not there a moment before will appear in one of the deep chambers. Something that looks like it might once have been a piece of the ship's original structure, but that has been so thoroughly transformed that it is now something else entirely. A piece of living architecture that grows and changes and evolves in real time, reaching toward the ceiling with tendrils of corrupted metal and organic matter that seem to be searching for something, reaching for something, trying to connect with something that exists beyond the physical structure of the ship, and somewhere in the infinite swirling madness of the warp itself. This is the belly of the beast. This is the foundation upon which the rest of the plague Voidship is built, the dark, organic substrate from which everything above draws its sustenance and its power. And during the night cycle, when the upper levels are at their quietest and the ship's vital energies are at their lowest ebb, the deep holds come alive in ways that even the Death Guard find fascinating. The pulse of the ship's organic systems grows stronger down here, the breathing of the walls more pronounced, the bioluminescence brighter and more varied. It is as if the ship is dreaming, processing the experiences of the day cycle in the same way that a biological brain processes experiences during sleep. And the deep holds are where those dreams take physical form. But the deep holds, for all their strangeness, are not the spiritual heart of the plague Voidship. That distinction belongs to another place entirely, a place that sits at the metaphysical center of the vessel, in the same way that the bridge sits at its tactical center and the engine room sits at its physical center. This is the chapel of the Grandfather, the shrine, the temple, at the sacred space where the Death Guard and their mortal servants come to give thanks for the blessings of disease and to pray for the continued favor of the God who has given them purpose and power and a kind of immortality that no one in their right mind would ever want. Every plague Voidship has such a place. It is as essential to the vessel's function as the engines or the weapons systems, and in some ways it is more important because the engines and the weapons can be repaired or replaced. But the spiritual connection between the ship and its patron deity must be maintained through constant, devoted worship. The chapel of the Grandfather is where that worship happens, and it is a place of immense power and immense danger, a focal point for the warp energies that Nurgle channels through his most faithful servants. As the chapel occupies what was once the ship's main cathedral. On Imperial vessels, these spaces are enormous, soaring affairs of stone and metal and stained glass, designed to inspire awe and reverence in the crew who gather there to worship the god Emperor. The chapel on a plague Voidship has retained much of that grandeur, but it has been transformed, corrupted, made over in the image of the Grandfather's garden in the same way that everything else on the ship has been transformed. The walls, which might once have been covered in frescoes depicting the Emperor's great victories and the saints who served him, are now covered in organic growth that has formed into patterns of its own, swirling, fractal designs that echo the geometry of disease. The branching networks of infection that spread through a body like rivers delta through a landscape. The stained glass windows, where they still exist, depict scenes that no loyalist would recognize. Images of bloated, cheerful figures distributing gifts of plague to grateful supplicants, of garden worlds being transformed into paradises of decay, of Nurgle himself sitting upon his throne in the heart of his garden, surrounded by his children, and smiling a smile that somehow manages to be both benevolent and absolutely terrifying. The altar at the center of the chapel is the most significant feature of the space. It is massive, carved from a single block of what appears to be stone, but that is actually a mineral formation that has grown from the deck of the ship itself, as pushed upward by the pressure of the organic growth beneath it over the course of centuries. The surface of the altar is concave, forming a natural bowl that is permanently filled with a thick, greenish liquid that bubbles and steams with its own internal heat. This liquid is the plague brew, a concentrated mixture of every disease and biological agent that has been cultivated on the ship, blended together into a sacramental substance that the Death Guard use in their most sacred rituals. To drink from the plague brew is to receive the Grandfather's direct blessing, to feel his power flowing through your veins like liquid fire, transforming and corrupting and elevating all at once. Only the most devoted servants are permitted this honor, and even among the Death Guard, it is not undertaken lightly. Around the altar, the chapel is arranged in concentric circles, with the innermost ring reserved for the plague marines and the outer rings for the mortal crew. The seating, such as it is, consists of rows of fungal growths that have formed into shapes, roughly approximating pews, their surfaces spongy and yielding, covered in a fine down of mold that gives them the appearance of being upholstered in some exotic, alien fabric. The air in the chapel is thick with incense, although that word does not adequately describe what fills the atmosphere. The censers that hang from the ceiling on chains of corroded metal burn not with any conventional substance, but with dried and processed plague matter, the concentrated essence of a dozen different diseases reduced to a powder and set alight, releasing clouds of spore-laden smoke that fill the chapel with a haze so dense that visibility drops to a few meters in any direction. To breathe this air is to breathe disease, and the mortal crew who attend services in the chapel are visibly affected by it, coughing and weeping and shaking with fever as the spores settle in their lungs and begin their slow, sacred work. The services themselves are conducted by the ship's spiritual leaders, a combination of dark apostles who have adapted the liturgies of the word-bearers to Nurgle's specific requirements, and corrupted chaplains who were once members of the Death Guard's own spiritual hierarchy. These leaders wear robes that were once white, but that are now a mosaic of stains and growths, decorated with the symbols of Nurgle and hung with fetishes made from dried organs and bones and vials of preserved disease. They speak in voices that are deep and resonant and strangely soothing, their words carrying a cadence that is part sermon and part lullaby, designed to calm the minds and open the souls of their congregation to the Grandfather's influence. The prayers of the Death Guard are not what you might expect from the servants of a Chaos God. There is no screaming, there is no bloodletting, there is no ecstatic frenzy of the kind that you might see in a temple of Khorne or Slaanesh. The worship of Nurgle is a quieter thing, a more contemplative thing, and the prayers that the Death Guard offer to their god reflect this. They are slow, measured, almost meditative, are spoken in low voices that blend together into a drone that fills the chapel with a sound not unlike the humming of a beehive. The words themselves are in a mixture of High Gothic, the Dark Tongue, and a dialect that is unique to the Death Guard, a language that has evolved over 10,000 years of separation from the Imperium, and that incorporates sounds and concepts that have no equivalent in any human language. The content of the prayers is, in its way, remarkably similar to the prayers offered in any imperial church. The Death Guard give thanks for blessings received. They ask for strength in the coming battles. They pray for the health and prosperity of their brothers, although their definition of health would make an imperial physician turn white with horror. They offer their achievements to the Grandfather, reporting on the plagues they have spread and the worlds they have corrupted, like children showing their schoolwork to a parent and hoping for approval. And they pray for the great work to be completed, for the day when every world in the galaxy is a plague world and every living thing bears the Grandfather's mark, the ultimate expression of Nurgle's will and the final victory of decay over order, of entropy over stasis, of the natural cycle over the artificial preservation that the Imperium represents. During the night cycle, the chapel does not close. It cannot close. Worship is as essential to the function of the plague Voidship as fuel or ammunition, and the prayers must continue around the clock, maintaining the psychic connection between the ship and the warp that keeps Nurgle's power flowing through its corrupted systems. But the nature of the worship changes as the ship settles into its rest cycle. The formal services give way to a more informal, personal devotion. Small groups of mortal crew members come and go, kneeling before the altar for a few minutes of private prayer before returning to their duties. Individual plague marines visit the chapel to offer their own devotions, sitting in silence before the bubbling plague brew and communing with the grandfather in whatever private way has meaning for them. And the nurglings, ever present and ever irreverent, play in the aisles and climb the altar and dip their tiny, pustulant hands into the plague brew, giggling as the sacred substance burns their flesh and heals it in the same instant. The chapel is also where the ship's bells are housed. The bells of a plague void ship are among its most distinctive features, and their sound is as much a part of the vessel's identity as its hull profile or its arsenal. These are not ordinary bells. They are the doomsday bells, the cursed plague bells, massive instruments of corroded bronze and something that might be bone, hung in a tower that rises from the chapel like a finger pointing toward the heavens, and that is visible from nearly every point in the ship's interior. When they ring, and they ring at regular intervals throughout the day and night cycle, their sound carries through every corridor and compartment and hold, a deep, resonant tolling that vibrates in the bones and the teeth and the very walls of the ship. The sound is not merely auditory, it is psychic. It carries a payload of Nurgle's power that reinforces the corruption in everything it touches, strengthening the organic growth, invigorating the demons, deepening the connection between the ship and the warp. When the bells ring, the ship shudders slightly, as if in response to a beloved voice, and the bioluminescence in the corridors flares brighter for a moment before settling back to its usual sickly glow. The noxious Blightbringer is the keeper of the bells, and his role is one of the most important on the entire ship. He is responsible for maintaining the bell's proper tone and timing, ensuring that each ring carries the correct psychic resonance and that the schedule of tolling is maintained without interruption. The Blightbringer himself is immediately recognizable by the cursed plague bell that he carries at all times, and a smaller, portable version of the chapel bells that produces the same psychic effect on a personal scale. When the Blightbringer walks through the corridors of the ship, the bell swings at his hip, and every step sends a pulse of corrupted sound through the surrounding air, causing the organic growths to pulse in sympathy, and the Nurglings to swarm in his wake like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The chapel, then, is the spiritual engine of the plague void ship, the heart that pumps not blood, but faith through the vessel's corrupted arteries. It is where the Death Guard come closest to the grandfather, where the boundary between the material world and Nurgle's garden thins to the point of transparency, and where the power that sustains the ship and its crew is renewed and reinforced through the simple, ancient act of worship. And during the night cycle, when the chapel is at its most quiet and its most intimate, the connection between the ship and the warp is at its strongest, a thread of psychic energy that stretches from the altar through the hull and out into the infinite, swirling madness of the Imperium, connecting every soul on board to the vast, loving, terrible presence that watches over them all. Which brings us to the warp. Because a plague void ship does not merely travel through the warp in the way that an imperial vessel travels through the warp. An imperial ship enters the Imperium as a foreigner entering a hostile country, protected by Geller fields and guided by navigators and shielded from the horrors outside by layers of technology and faith and sheer desperate willpower. A plague void ship enters the warp like a fish returning to water. It belongs there. It is part of the warp in a way that no imperial vessel could ever be. Its corrupted hull permeable to the currents of psychic energy that flow through the Imperium. Its organic systems feeding on the raw stuff of chaos, in the same way that a living organism feeds on nutrients in its environment. When a plague void ship is in the warp, it is not just traveling. It is feeding. It is growing. It is becoming more of what it already is, drawing strength and sustenance from the sea of corruption that surrounds it, and channeling that power into its systems, its weapons, its crew, and its plagues. The experience of being aboard a plague void ship while it is in the warp is something that defies easy description. On an imperial vessel, the warp is kept at bay. The Geller field creates a bubble of reality around the ship, a pocket of normal space in which the laws of physics continue to function, and the nightmares of the Imperium are held at arm's length. The crew knows that the warp is out there, pressing against the field, testing it for weaknesses, whispering through the thin places in the hull with voices that promise everything and mean nothing. But as long as the field holds, they are safe, relatively. On a plague voidship, there is no Geller field. Or rather, there is a Geller field, but it has been modified, corrupted, adjusted to serve a very different purpose than the one for which it was originally designed. Instead of keeping the warp out, the modified field allows specific types of warp energy to pass through while blocking others. It is a selective barrier, and a filter that admits the power of Nurgle while excluding the influence of the other Chaos gods and the random, uncontrolled energies of the warp that could damage even a thoroughly corrupted vessel. The result is an environment that is partially in the warp and partially in real space, a hybrid zone where the rules of both realities apply simultaneously and where things can happen that would be impossible in either reality alone. Walking the corridors of a plague voidship in the warp is like walking through a fever dream that has been given physical form. The walls breathe more deeply, their organic surfaces expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matches the pulse of the Imperium itself. The bioluminescence shifts and changes, cycling through colors that have no names in any human language, in colors that should not exist in the spectrum of visible light, but that the eyes somehow perceive anyway, burning themselves into the visual cortex with an intensity that leaves after images for hours. The sounds change too. The constant hum of the ship's engines deepens into something that is less a sound and more a vibration, a frequency that resonates with the fundamental structure of reality itself, and that makes every atom in the body sing in sympathy. And layered on top of that vibration are the voices of the warp, the whispers and screams and songs of the entities that inhabit the Imperium, filtered through the ship's modified Geller field until they become a constant, low-level background noise that is always there, always just on the edge of perception, like the sound of the sea heard from a distant shore. And the visual effects are the most dramatic. Through the viewing ports, where there are viewing ports that have not been overgrown by the organic matter that covers the interior of the ship, the warp is visible in all its terrible glory. It is not the featureless, roiling chaos that the imperial texts describe. Through the filter of the plague voidship's modified field, the warp appears as a landscape, a vast, sprawling, infinitely detailed landscape of corruption and growth and decay that stretches in every direction. This is Nurgle's garden, or a reflection of it, a pocket of the plague, God's realm that extends outward from the ship like an aura, drawn to it by the corruption that saturates its hull and sustained by the worship that flows from the chapel and the prayers of the crew. The garden is beautiful. That is the terrible thing. It is beautiful in the way that a poisonous flower is beautiful, in the way that a predator in motion is beautiful, in the way that the mathematics of a particularly deadly epidemic curve is beautiful to someone who understands the elegance of exponential growth. The plants that fill the garden are twisted and colorful and teeming with a life that is both familiar and alien. Flowers that bloom in shades of purple and red and yellow that are too vivid, too saturated, too intense to be real, their petals dripping with nectars that are probably lethal, but that smell, even through the sealed hull of the ship, absolutely divine. Trees with gnarled, rotting trunks support canopies of leaves that shift and change color with the mood of the warp, their branches hung with fruits that pulse with bioluminescence and that contain, right within their swollen, glistening skin, concentrations of disease so potent that a single one could end civilizations. The creatures that move through the garden are Nurgle's demons, visible here in their natural habitat, going about the business of their existence with a cheerful, purposeful energy that is somehow comforting in its familiarity. Plague-bearers march in orderly columns along paths that wind between the trees, their single eyes focused on the scrolls and tallies they carry, counting and recording and cataloguing the diseases of the garden with the obsessive dedication that is their defining characteristic. Great unclean ones, the greater demons of Nurgle, sit in clearings and by the banks of rivers that run thick with something that is definitely not water, tending their portions of the garden with a paternal care that echoes the grandfather's own relationship with his realm. Beasts of Nurgle bound through the undergrowth, their tentacles flailing, their faces split in permanent grins of innocent, lethal joy, looking for anything that moves so they can play with it until it stops moving forever. And above it all, if you look carefully, if you let your eyes adjust to the impossible colors and the alien geometries of the warp, you might catch a glimpse of something larger. Something that sits at the center of the garden, like a spider at the center of its web. Something so vast and so ancient and so thoroughly saturated with the power of decay that its very existence warps the fabric of reality around it. This is Nurgle himself, or rather, this is the echo of Nurgle, of the shadow of his presence that falls across his realm like the shadow of a mountain falls across a valley, too large and too omnipresent to be seen directly, but unmistakable in the way it shapes everything around it. The grandfather is always there, always watching, always tending his garden with the patience and the care and the absolute, unshakable conviction that one day, everything in the universe will be part of it. For the crew of the Plague Voidship, the sight of the garden through the viewing ports is a source of comfort rather than terror. This is their heaven, their paradise, the destination toward which all their devotion and all their suffering is directed. When they die, their souls will not be torn apart by the predators of the warp or sucked into the void of oblivion. They will be gathered into the garden, as absorbed into the cycle of decay and renewal that is the fundamental truth of Nurgle's realm, and they will become part of something eternal. This is the promise that sustains them through the misery of their diseased existence, the hope that makes the pain bearable and the corruption acceptable. In the garden, there is no suffering. In the garden, there is only the endless, peaceful cycle of growth and decay, of life feeding on death, feeding on life, forever and ever, without end. But the warp is not all gardens and demons. It is also danger. Even a plague voidship, blessed as it is by the plague god, is not immune to the hazards of the Imperium. The other chaos gods have no love for Nurgle's servants, and their demons prowl the edges of the garden like wolves circling a campfire, looking for weaknesses, looking for opportunities, looking for a way in. The bloodletters of Khorne, the flamers of Sinch, the demonettes of Slanesh, all of them would love nothing more than to breach the modified Geller field and tear through the ship, slaughtering its crew and consuming its power. The Death Guard are vigilant against these incursions, and during the night cycle, when the ship's defenses are at their most relaxed, the watch is doubled and the Plague Marines patrol the corridors in full battle readiness, their weapons charged and their senses alert for any sign of intrusion from outside the protective bubble of Nurgle's influence. The night cycle on a Plague Voidship in the warp is when the ship is at its most alive and its most vulnerable simultaneously. The organic systems are at their most active, but feeding greedily on the ambient warp energy that passes through the modified Geller field, growing and evolving and adapting in real time. The bioluminescence pulses with a brightness and a complexity that it never achieves in real space, painting the corridors and chambers with patterns of light that shift and change in ways that seem to carry meaning, as if the ship itself is trying to communicate through a language of color and movement that no one has learned to read. The temperature fluctuates more wildly than usual, hot zones and cold zones shifting and moving through the ship in ways that follow no physical logic, but that correspond to the flow of warp energy through the hull. And the sounds, the constant, layered, endlessly complex symphony of sounds that defines life aboard a Plague Voidship, will reach a crescendo that is simultaneously overwhelming and strangely beautiful. A chorus of organic noise and mechanical vibration and warp resonance that fills every corner of the ship, with a music that is not quite music and a meaning that is not quite meaning. This is what it sounds like to be inside a living thing. This is what it sounds like to be a cell in the body of something vast and ancient and utterly alien, something that breathes and grows and thinks in ways that have nothing to do with human cognition and everything to do with the primal, fundamental processes of life and death and the eternal cycle that connects them. The plague Voidship is not a machine that has been corrupted. It is a machine that has been brought to life, given a consciousness and a purpose and a soul by the power of a God who sees in decay not an ending, but a beginning, not destruction but transformation, not death, but the necessary precursor to new and more wonderful forms of life. And now, let us talk about the quiet hours, the deepest part of the night cycle, the time when even on a vessel that never truly sleeps, the activity drops to its absolute minimum, and something very close to silence settles over the corrupted decks and corridors and holds of the plague Voidship. This is the time that the mortal crew fears the most, and that the Death Guard, if they are honest, find the most interesting. Because it is during these quiet hours that the ship reveals its true nature, peeling back the layers of activity and noise and motion that normally mask its deeper processes and exposing, and for a few brief hours, the fundamental reality of what it means to be a vessel that has been claimed by the Lord of Decay. The silence is not true silence, of course. There is always sound on a Voidship, the hum of engines, the breathing of walls, the scuttle of small things in the ventilation ducts. But during the quiet hours, these sounds diminish to a level that allows other, usually inaudible sounds to be heard. Sounds that come from within the structure of the ship itself, from the organic matter that has replaced or consumed most of the original construction material. These sounds are subtle, almost subliminal, and they take many forms. There is a creaking, like the sound of a wooden ship at sea, as the organic material expands and contracts in response to temperature changes and warp currents. There is a gurgling, much like the sound of a digestive system processing its contents, as fluids move through the network of organic pipes and tubes that have replaced the ship's original plumbing. There is a whispering, like the sound of leaves rustling in a breeze, as the fungal growths on the walls release their spores into the air in rhythmic bursts that correspond to some biological clock that ticks to a schedule all its own. And beneath all of these sounds, so quiet that it might be nothing more than the product of a stressed and exhausted imagination, there is a heartbeat, a slow, deep, rhythmic pulse that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, that rises and falls with a regularity that suggests something organic, something alive, is something that has been beating in the darkness of the ship's deepest interior for so long that it has become a part of the vessel's fundamental structure. The mortal crew members who have been aboard the ship the longest claim that they can feel this heartbeat, not just hear it, that it resonates in their own chests in a way that gradually brings their own heart rhythms into alignment with it, so that over time, their hearts beat in perfect synchrony with the heart of the ship. Whether this is true or merely a symptom of their ongoing mental deterioration is, like so many things on a plague Voidship, a question without a clear answer. The quiet hours are when the ship's organic systems do their most important work. This is when the growth happens, the literal physical growth that slowly, over centuries, transforms every surface and every structure on the vessel into something that is more organic than mechanical. If you were to sit in a corridor during the quiet hours and watch carefully, you might actually see it happening, the organic matter on the walls expanding by a fraction of a millimeter, extending new tendrils into unclaimed territory, colonizing a fresh patch of deck plating or engulfing a previously exposed section of pipe. The growth is slow, imperceptible in the course of a single night, but over the months and years and centuries, it adds up. The ship is slowly being consumed by its own biology, transformed from within, eaten alive by the corruption that sustains it. And in 10,000 years, the process has covered perhaps 90% of the vessel's interior, leaving only the most critical mechanical systems. Thus the engines, the weapons, the navigation arrays, still partially exposed and partially functional in their original state. During the quiet hours, the plague marines who are not on watch duty enter a state that is not quite sleep and not quite meditation, but something in between. They sit or stand or lean against the walls of their quarters, their eyes half closed, their breathing slow and deep, their massive bodies utterly still, except for the gentle rise and fall of their chests. In this state, they are partially present in the material world and partially present somewhere else, somewhere that is not quite the warp and not quite real space, but a boundary zone between the two, a place where the consciousness of a plague marine can interact with the consciousness of the ship, and through the ship, with the consciousness of Nurgle himself. Well, this communion, for lack of a better word, is an intensely personal experience for each plague marine, and no two of them describe it in quite the same way. Some speak of walking through a garden that is both familiar and alien, a reflection of the grandfather's realm that is tailored to their individual psychology and their individual relationship with the plague god. Others speak of hearing a voice, deep and warm and infinitely patient, that speaks to them in words that they cannot quite remember upon waking, but that leave behind a feeling of profound peace and absolute certainty. And some speak of simply existing, of floating in a warm, dark void where all pain has ceased and all worry has been lifted, and all that remains is the simple, ancient satisfaction of being part of something greater than oneself. These quiet hour communions are the closest thing that the Death Guard have to rest, and they emerge from them refreshed in a way that goes beyond the physical. Their bodies have been healed, at least partially, the accumulated damage of their diseased existence repaired just enough to maintain function for another cycle. Their minds have been calmed, the accumulated stress and rage and frustration of their endless war smoothed away by the grandfather's psychic touch. And their faith has been renewed, the connection between servant and God strengthened and deepened in ways that will sustain them through whatever horrors the next cycle brings. But the quiet hours do not last. Nothing does on a plague voidship. The cycle turns, the engines shift to a higher register, the lumens begin their slow return to what passes for full brightness, and then the ship stirs from its half-sleep, shaking off the quiet hours like a dog shaking off water, and preparing for another cycle of war and worship and the eternal, grinding advance of decay across the stars. The sounds come first. The distant tolling of the chapel bells, their deep, resonant notes carrying through the corridors and compartments and holds, signaling the end of the quiet hours and the beginning of a new cycle. The hum of the engines rising from its overnight murmur to a full-throated roar that vibrates through the deck plates and makes the organic growths on the walls pulse in sympathy. The clatter of the mortal crew stumbling from their bunks and shuffling toward their duty stations, coughing and scratching and muttering the morning prayers that have been burned into their brains by years of repetition. The wet, and heavy sound of the plague marines donning their armor, the ceramite and organic components grinding together as the suit seals itself around the warrior's body, becoming part of him once again, as the night's partial separation is reversed. The activity builds quickly, layer upon layer, until the ship is once again humming with the full chaotic energy of its wakeful state. The auger arrays sweep the void around the ship, searching for targets, for threats, for opportunities. The communications officer receives and processes a stream of warp-distorted transmissions from other plague ships in the fleet, exchanging intelligence and coordinates and gossip in the crackling, buzzing dialect that serves as the Death Guard's version of ship-to-ship communication. The biologous putrefier checks on the overnight progress of his experiments, in noting which cultures have grown, which subjects have succumbed, which new strains have emerged from the eternal churn of mutation and selection that drives his work. The Chaos Lord on the bridge reviews the tactical situation, comparing the ship's current position with its intended course, and making adjustments with the calm, methodical precision of a commander who has been doing this for longer than most imperial institutions have existed. And somewhere in the middle of it all, in the chaos and the noise and the organized madness of a new cycle beginning, there is a moment of pause, a moment when the last echoes of the quiet hours have not quite faded, and the full noise of the new cycle has not quite begun. A gap between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and the next, where the ship and its crew exist in a state of perfect, suspended stillness. It lasts less than a second, this moment, but if you are paying attention, if you are attuned to the rhythms of the plague Voidship in the way that only a long-term inhabitant can be, you might catch it. And in that moment, you might feel something that is almost but not quite like peace. A sense that for all the horror and the corruption and the disease and the war, for all the suffering and the madness and the slow, inexorable march toward universal decay, there is something here that works, something that functions, something that has achieved a kind of equilibrium between the forces of creation and destruction, of growth and decay, of life and death, that is, in its own utterly alien way, harmonious. That is the great secret of the plague Voidship. That is the truth that lurks beneath the surface of all the horror and the grotesquerie and the 10,000-year accumulation of disease and corruption. The ship works, not in spite of its corruption, but because of it. The organic systems that have consumed the vessel's original machinery are more efficient, more adaptable, more resilient than anything the Mechanicum ever designed. The crew that serves aboard the ship, for all their suffering, is bound together by a sense of community and shared purpose that many Imperial vessels would envy. The Death Guard who command the ship are experienced, competent, and motivated by a faith that is as deep and as genuine as anything felt by the most devout servant of the God Emperor. Everything about the plague Voidship is wrong by Imperial standards. Yes, and yet everything about it functions with a terrible, elegant efficiency that suggests something that no loyal servant of the Imperium would ever want to admit. That perhaps Nurgle is right. That perhaps decay is not the enemy of life but its most essential partner. That perhaps the universe is not a machine to be maintained and protected from entropy, but a garden to be cultivated. A garden where death feeds life and life feeds death in an endless cycle that is not tragic but beautiful, not destructive but creative, not an ending but a perpetual becoming. The Death Guard believe this. They believe it with every fibre of their corrupted being. And as they rise from their quiet hour communions and take up their weapons and their duties and their plagues and prepare for another cycle of war against the Imperium that cast them out, as they do so not with anger or bitterness or despair, but with the calm, unshakable conviction that they are doing the Grandfather's work and that the Grandfather's work is good. But before we begin our closing thoughts, we have left a great many chambers unexplored. And if we are to truly understand what a single night aboard this vessel entails, we must visit every major organ of this diseased body. We have walked the corridors and the bridge and the crew decks. We have spent time among the plague marines and peered into the biologus laboratories. We have descended into the deep holds and prayed in the chapel of the Grandfather. We have stared into the warp through the viewing ports and felt the ship's heartbeat during the quiet hours. But there are places we have not yet been, essential places, as places that keep this thing moving through the stars. Let us go to the engine room. On an Imperial warship, the engine room, more properly called the Enginarium, is a vast cathedral of technology. It houses the plasma reactors that provide power to the ship's systems, the warp drives that allow it to translate between real space and the immaterium, and the sublight engines that push it through the void when it is not traveling through the warp. The Enginarium is the domain of the Adeptus Mechanicus, tended by tech priests who commune with the machine spirits of the great engines through rituals of oil and incantation, who view the reactor cores as sacred objects deserving of reverence equal to any relic of the Emperor himself. it is a place of heat and noise and power. Where the raw energy of contained stellar fusion is channeled through systems of such complexity that no single mind, human or otherwise, can fully comprehend their workings. On a plague voidship, the Engineerium is all of these things, and something more. Something that defies the neat categorization of Imperial engineering because it has ceased to be purely mechanical and has become, like everything else on the ship, a hybrid of technology and biology that operates according to principles that the Mechanicum would consider heretical and that Nurgle would consider beautiful. The plasma reactors still burn at the heart of the ship, their contained fusion reactions providing the raw energy that powers everything from the weapons arrays to the life support systems to the corrupted Geller field generators. But the reactors have been changed. The containment fields that keep the plasma from breaching its housing have been supplemented and in some places replaced by organic barriers that have grown over the original magnetic containment coils. These barriers are made of a biological material that is extraordinarily resistant to heat and radiation, a living substance that has evolved in the extreme environment of the reactor chamber and that feeds on the very energy it contains, growing stronger and more resilient with each passing century. The reactors burn hotter than they should, pushed beyond their original design specifications by the organic modifications, and the excess heat is channeled through the ship's biological infrastructure, providing warmth and energy to the organic growth that covers the interior. The tech priests who tend these engines are the Dark Mechanicum, servants of the machine god who have been twisted by Nurgle's influence into something that bridges the gap between the mechanical and the organic in the most literal way possible. Their augmetic limbs have been fused with living tissue, metal and flesh growing together in a synthesis that gives these corrupted adepts an intuitive understanding of the ship's hybrid systems that no purely mechanical being could achieve. They move through the engine room with a fluid grace that belies their grotesque appearance, their multiple limbs allowing them to navigate the complex, three-dimensional maze of pipes and conduits and organic tubes. The sounds in the engine room are different from anywhere else on the ship. The deep, a constant roar of the plasma reactors provides a bass note that vibrates through every surface, a physical presence felt as much as heard. Layered on top of this is the hiss of steam and the gurgle of coolant and the rhythmic pounding of the great pistons that drive the sublight engines. But woven through these mechanical sounds are organic ones, the pulse of biological pumps, the wet squelching of organic valves, the low humming of living tissue vibrating in sympathy with the plasma reactions within. The heat is intense. The engine room is the warmest place on the ship by a significant margin. Condensation runs down every surface in rivulets that pool on the deck plates, forming shallow lakes of warm, faintly luminous water. The organic growth here is the most vigorous on the entire vessel, fed by the combination of heat and moisture and radiation. Fungal forests have sprouted in the spaces between the great engine housings, their caps reaching toward the distant ceiling, their stalks thick as a man's torso. Vines of something that looks like ivy have woven themselves through the pipes and conduits, gripping the metal with a strength that makes them practically impossible to remove. During the night cycle, the engines are throttled back to a maintenance level, producing just enough power to keep essential systems running. The roar of the reactors drops to a rumble, the pounding of the pistons slows to a steady beat, and the engine room takes on an almost meditative quality. The Dark Mechanicum adepts use this quiet time to perform their most delicate work, moving through the engine room with a reverence that is equal parts mechanical expertise and religious devotion. Now let us consider the armory and the preparation bays. These are the spaces where the tools of war are stored and maintained, where the plague marines prepare their weapons and their armor for the campaigns that are the ship's ultimate purpose. The armory of a plague voidship is a vast, echoing space filled with racks of weaponry that spans the entire history of the Death Guard, from bolt weapons that were forged before the Horus heresy to demonic artifacts that were claimed from the warp itself. The weapons are maintained with a care that might seem surprising given the state of the rest of the ship. But that makes perfect sense when you understand the Death Guard's mindset. These are professional soldiers and are warriors who take their craft seriously. And while they might not care about the rust and corruption that covers their armor and their environment, they care very much about the functionality of the weapons that allow them to wage the long war. The bolt guns are the workhorse weapons of the Death Guard, as they are for all Space Marines, loyalist or traitor. But these are not the gleaming, precisely machined weapons that roll off the production lines of Mars or the great Forge worlds. These are ancient things, many of them older than the Imperium itself, their original components worn and replaced and modified so many times over the millennia that nothing of the original weapon remains except the basic design principles. Their barrels are pitted and scored by 10,000 years of use. Their mechanisms are caked with a residue that is part weapon oil, part biological secretion, and part something that defies analysis. And yet they function, they fire, they kill. Because the Death Guard, for all their corruption, understand their weapons with an intimacy that goes beyond mere technical knowledge, an understanding that has been built up over millennia of constant use and that allows them to coax performance from weapons that any Imperial armorer would condemn as unserviceable. The plague weapons are stored separately, in sealed containers that are labeled with the specific biological agents they carry and the targets for which they are intended. These include the plague sprayers used by the foul Blightspawn, the blight grenades carried by every plague marine, and the specialized munitions used by the ship's heavy weapons platforms. Each weapon is a delivery system for one or more of the diseases cultivated in the biologus laboratories, and the process of loading them, of filling the reservoirs and magazines with the correct biological agents in the correct concentrations, is a task that requires both scientific precision and a certain artistic sensibility. The Death Guard who perform this work do so with the same care that an artist might take in mixing paints, adjusting the mixture until it achieves exactly the right consistency, the right potency, the right balance of lethality and transmissibility. The preparation bays are adjacent to the armory, and they are where the Plague Marines go through the rituals that prepare them for combat. Thus, these rituals are a blend of the practical and the spiritual, a combination of weapons checks and armor maintenance and prayers to the Grandfather that have been refined over 10,000 years into a seamless, almost choreographed sequence of actions that transforms the individual Plague Marine from a resting warrior into a fully prepared instrument of destruction. The process takes several hours and is typically carried out in small groups, with the members of a squad preparing together, assisting each other with the more complex elements of the ritual and offering encouragement and blessings as each warrior completes his preparations. During the night cycle, the armory and preparation bays are quiet but not empty. There are always Plague Marines who use the quiet hours to work on their weapons, as to modify and improve and personalize the tools of their trade with the patient. Meticulous attention to detail that characterizes everything the Death Guard do. A warrior might spend an entire night's cycle working on a single bolt round, adjusting its payload of biological agents to optimize it for a specific target, testing and retesting the detonation mechanism until he is satisfied that it will deliver its payload with maximum efficiency. This kind of obsessive attention to detail might seem excessive, but for a warrior who has been fighting the same war for 10,000 years, it is simply the way things are done. There is no rush. There is no deadline. There is only the work, and the work must be done right. Now let us turn now to a part of the ship that we have mentioned but not fully explored: the landing craft bays and launch facilities. These are the spaces from which the Death Guard project their power onto the worlds they target. The hangars and docking bays and drop pod chambers that house the vehicles and transports that carry the Plague Marines from their ship to the surface of whatever planet has been chosen for the Grandfather's attention. The launch bays of a Plague Voidship are enormous, cavernous spaces that occupy a significant portion of the vessel's internal volume. On an Imperial ship, these bays would be maintained to exacting standards, the deck plates clean and level, the atmosphere carefully controlled, the launch systems calibrated to precise tolerances. On a plague voidship, the launch bays have been transformed into something that more closely resembles the loading dock of a nightmare than a military facility. The deck is covered in the same organic growth that covers the rest of the ship, but here it has formed into ridges and channels that guide the flow of biological waste toward drainage points that connect to the ship's internal fluid system. The dropships that squat on their landing pads are corroded and festering, their hulls patched with organic matter, where conventional repairs have proven impossible, their interiors saturated with the same ambient corruption that fills the rest of the vessel. The drop pods are perhaps the most disturbing feature of the launch bays. These single-use assault vehicles are designed to be fired from orbit, as carrying a payload of plague marines directly into the heart of an enemy position. On a plague voidship, the drop pods have been modified to serve a dual purpose. They deliver warriors, yes, but they also deliver disease. The impact of a plague drop pod creates a zone of contamination at the landing site, a spreading circle of biological agents that begins to infect the environment immediately on contact. By the time the plague marines emerge from their pods and begin their assault, the ground around them is already seething with disease, the air thick with spores, the very soil corrupted by pathogens that will continue to spread long after the battle is over and the Death Guard have moved on. During the night cycle, the launch bays are maintained by teams of mortal crew who work under the supervision of the Dark Mechanicum adepts to keep the dropships and drop pods in a state of readiness. This maintenance is a never-ending task, because the organic growth that covers the vessels is constantly expanding, constantly threatening to clog engine intakes and jam control surfaces and block weapon ports. The crew fights a running battle against the ship's own biology, clearing growths that will return within days and lubricating mechanisms that will seize up again within hours. It is a task of mythic futility, like sweeping sand from a desert or bailing water from a sinking ship. And yet they do it, day after day and night after night, because the alternative, a drop pod that fails to launch or a dropship that cannot achieve orbit, that is not something that any servant of the Death Guard wants to be responsible for. The maintenance crews work in near silence during the night cycle, the sounds of their labors muffled by the thick atmosphere and the soft, constant noise of the organic growth that surrounds them. They communicate through gestures and whispered commands, their voices kept low, not out of any particular need for stealth, but out of a habit that has developed over years of working in an environment where raising one's voice feels wrong, as if the ship itself might take offense at unnecessary noise. There is a rhythm to their work that is almost meditative, a repetitive, physical activity that occupies the hands while leaving the mind free to wander. And during the quiet hours, the maintenance crews often fall into a trance-like state, their bodies performing their tasks on autopilot, while their minds drift through the warm, dark corridors of the half-sleep that is the closest thing to rest that the ship's mortal inhabitants can achieve. Let us also consider the communications arrays and the ways in which the Plague Voidship maintains contact with the rest of the Death Guard fleet and with the broader forces of chaos. Communication across the void is difficult under the best of circumstances. The distances involved are so vast that even the speed of light is inadequate, and the standard means of faster-than-light communication in the Imperium, the psychic transmissions of the astropaths, is not available to the servants of chaos in quite the same form. As the Death Guard use a combination of methods to maintain contact with their allies and to gather intelligence about their enemies. The primary means of communication is through the warp itself. The ship's organic systems, which are attuned to the currents of the Imperium, can detect and interpret psychic signals that have been transmitted through the warp by other plague ships and by the plague planet, Mortarian's stronghold in the Eye of Terror. These signals are not clean, precise transmissions in the way that an astropathic message might be. They are more like flavors or scents, subtle changes in the psychic environment that carry information encoded in ways that only a corrupted mind can decipher. The communications officer on the bridge, the creature with the buzzing, insectoid voice that we encountered earlier. He specializes in this form of communication, translating the subtle shifts in the warp into actionable intelligence that the Chaos Lord uses to make his strategic decisions. There are also more conventional means of communication. Vox transmitters and receivers, modified to function in the corrupted environment of the ship, allow short-range communication between vessels in the same fleet. These transmissions are heavily encrypted, using codes that combine mathematical algorithms with biological markers, sequences of disease symbols that change according to the progression of specific plague strains, making them virtually impossible for Imperial codebreakers to crack, because the key is literally a living thing that evolves and changes in real time. During the night cycle, the communications arrays are at their most sensitive. Because the reduced activity elsewhere on the ship means less interference for the delicate instruments that detect and process the psychic signals from the warp. This is when the most important communications are received and transmitted. The strategic messages from the plague planet, the intelligence reports from agents embedded in Imperial systems, the orders from the leaders of the plague companies that direct the movements of the fleet and the priorities of the campaign. The communications officer works through the night, her buzzing voice a constant low-level presence on the bridge, translating the whispers of the warp into words that the Chaos Lord and his officers can understand and act upon. And now, let us consider one final aspect of life aboard the plague Voidship that we have not yet addressed: the question of what happens when things go wrong. Because even a vessel blessed by the plague god is not immune to the hazards of the void and the warp, and the night cycle, with its reduced crew activity and its lower power levels, is when the ship is most vulnerable to the things that can go wrong. The most common threats are mundane ones, the same kinds of problems that plague any void ship, regardless of its allegiance. Hull breaches caused by micrometeorite impacts or structural fatigue, power fluctuations caused by instabilities in the reactor systems, navigation errors caused by the ever-shifting currents of the warp. These problems are dealt with by the same damage control procedures that any void ship employs, adapted for the unique circumstances of a plague vessel. Repair teams are dispatched to seal hull breaches. Although their patching materials are biological rather than mechanical, the ship's own organic growth being encouraged to seal the wound in the same way that a living body heals a cut. Power fluctuations are addressed by the dark mechanicum adepts in the engine room, who can feel the instabilities in the reactor through their organic interfaces and who adjust the containment fields with the intuitive precision that their communion with the engines allows. Navigation corrections are made through the biological sensor network, which can detect changes in the warp currents faster and more accurately than any mechanical instrument. But there are other threats. Threats that are unique to a vessel that travels through the warp without the full protection of a conventional Geller field. The modified field that allows Nurgle's influence to pass through while blocking other warp energies is not perfect. It has weaknesses, thin spots, areas where the filtering is less effective, and where the influence of the other Chaos gods can seep in. During the night cycle, when the ship's psychic defenses are at their lowest ebb, these weaknesses become more pronounced, and the demons that prowl the edges of the garden, the bloodletters and flamers and demonettes that hunger for the power contained within the plague ship, press their attacks with renewed vigor. When an incursion occurs, the response is swift and violent. The Death Guard are warriors first and foremost, and their training does not end when the night cycle begins. The Plague Marines who are on watch duty are armed and ready at all times, their weapons charged and their senses alert, and when the alarm sounds, the ship's entire Plague Marine complement can be mobilized in minutes. The fighting is brutal and close-quartered, the corridors of the ship too narrow for the large-scale tactical maneuvers that the Death Guard prefer, and the battles often devolve into vicious room-by-room melees where the advantage goes to whoever is more willing to take damage and keep fighting. The Death Guard always win these engagements. Always. The intruding demons, powerful as they might be, are fighting on enemy ground in an environment that is actively hostile to their existence. And the Plague Marines are defenders who know every corridor, every chamber, every hidden passage in the ship. The battles are never easy, and they sometimes result in significant damage to the ship and casualties among the mortal crew. But the Death Guard always win. It is a point of pride for them, a testament to their martial skill and their devotion to the Grandfather whose domain they defend. When the battle is over and the last intruder has been banished back to the warp, the Plague Marines clean their weapons and return to their quarters with the calm, satisfied air of professionals who have done a job well. The mortal crew, for their part, hunker down during these incursions, retreating to the sealed compartments and reinforced chambers that serve as storm shelters and praying to Nurgle for protection. The sounds of battle, or the crack of bolter fire, and the roar of chainswords, and the screaming of demons as they are destroyed, filter through the walls of their shelters, and the crew listens with a mixture of fear and fascination, knowing that the warriors who defend them are the same beings who enslaved them, and that the protection they offer comes at a price that is measured in disease and corruption, and the slow, irreversible transformation of everything they once were. And when the battle is over, when the all-clear sounds and the crew emerges from their shelters to assess the damage and begin the cleanup, they find the corridors changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be immediately obvious, but subtly, in the small details that only a long-term inhabitant would notice. Yet the organic growth on the walls is thicker in places where the fighting was heaviest, as if the ship has responded to the threat by reinforcing its defenses. The bioluminescence is brighter, more vivid, more complex in its patterns, and the heartbeat, the slow, deep pulse that permeates the ship's organic infrastructure, is stronger, more pronounced, as if the battle has invigorated the vessel in the same way that exercise invigorates a living body. The ship is learning, growing, adapting, becoming more of what it already is, with every cycle, every battle, every night that passes in the darkness between the stars. It is not a machine. It is not a building. It is not a vehicle. It is a living thing, as alive as any creature in the galaxy. And it is growing towards something that no one, not even the Death Guard who command it, can fully predict or understand. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all about a plague void ship. Not the diseases it carries, not the warriors it houses, not the demons it serves, but the simple, inescapable fact that it is alive, that it thinks, that it feels, that it has a will and a purpose and a destiny that it is pursuing with the same patient, inexorable determination that defines everything in Nurgle's domain. The plague void ship is not just a weapon of war. It is a statement of intent, a promise, a prophecy of what the galaxy will become if the forces of chaos are ever allowed to triumph, if the walls of faith and technology and human courage that hold back the tide ever falter and fall. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But aboard a plague void ship, during the quiet hours of the night cycle, when the engines hum softly and the walls breathe gently and the heartbeat pulses steadily in the organic darkness, there is something else too. Something that is not war, not peace, not life, not death, but all of these things at once, blended together into a state of existence that has no name in any human language, but that the servants of Nurgle understand instinctively, because it is what they have been living for 10,000 years. It is decay, and it is beautiful. The night ends, the bells toll, the ship wakes. And somewhere in the void between the stars, in the space where reality wears thin and the things that should not exist find room to grow, a plague void ship turns its prow toward a new target and begins its slow, inevitable approach. There is a world out there, a bright and clean and full of life, and it does not know what is coming. but it will. There is another chamber that deserves our attention on this tour through the plague Voidship, a chamber that exists in a state of profound irony that even the Death Guard seem to appreciate on some level. This is the Apothecarion, or rather, the twisted reflection of an Apothecarion, the place where the plague surgeon practices his peculiar form of medicine. On a loyalist space marine vessel, the Apothecarion is where battle brothers are healed, where the wounded are patched together and returned to fighting condition, where the gene seed of the fallen is harvested and preserved for future generations. It is a place of clean surfaces and bright lights and the precise, clinical efficiency of surgeons who have spent decades perfecting their craft. The Apothecarion represents the Imperium's commitment to preservation, to maintaining, to fighting against the entropy that threatens to consume everything. On a plague Voidship, the plague surgeon's domain represents the exact opposite of these ideals. The plague surgeon does not heal, not in any way that an imperial apothecary would recognize. Instead, the plague surgeon cultivates. He encourages. He nurtures the diseases that afflict his fellow Death Guard, tending them the way a gardener tends prize specimens, ensuring that each warrior's particular constellation of plagues remains in a state of productive equilibrium. Too much disease, and the warrior's combat effectiveness degrades beyond acceptable limits. Too little, and the warrior's connection to the grandfather weakens, leaving him vulnerable to the doubts and hesitations that plague, pardon the expression, any being who has been fighting the same war for 10 millennia without rest. The plague surgeon's chamber is a study in contradiction. It is simultaneously the most ordered and the most disgusting space on the ship. The surgical instruments are arranged with exacting precision on trays that are cleaned and sterilized, not with antiseptic, but with specific strains of bacteria that protect the instruments from contamination by the wrong diseases. The examination tables are covered in sheets that are changed regularly, replaced not with fresh linens, but with fresh growths of a particular mold that provides a comfortable, resilient surface, while simultaneously monitoring the patient's biological condition through direct contact with their skin. If the lighting is bright, the brightest on the ship, apart from the engine room, because the plague surgeon needs to see clearly in order to do his work, and the bioluminescent growths that provide illumination elsewhere on the ship are supplemented here by actual lumen globes, ancient devices that have been maintained with particular care because there is no biological replacement for their specific function. The plague surgeon himself is an imposing figure, even by the standards of the Death Guard. He stands slightly taller than most of his brothers, a height advantage that may have been part of the criteria for his selection for the role, or that may have developed over centuries of carrying the specialized equipment that is his stock in trade. Or his armor is modified to accommodate the additional gear he carries, racks of vials and syringes, pouches of dried biological agents, and the distinctive narthecium that is the badge of his office, a gauntlet-mounted device that can extract gene seed from a fallen brother or inject specific disease strains into a living one with equal facility. The narthecium has been extensively modified from its original imperial design, where once it was a tool of preservation, designed to extract and protect the precious gene seed that carries the legacy of the Primarch. It is now a tool of cultivation, designed to introduce, modify, and refine the diseases that make each plague marine unique. During the night cycle, the plague surgeon's chamber sees a steady stream of visitors, plague marines, who have noticed changes in their personal disease profiles and want them evaluated. Mortal crew members who have been selected, or in some cases, who have volunteered for the experimental inoculations that the surgeon develops in collaboration with the biologous putrefiers. And occasionally, a plague marine who has been wounded in battle and whose body is healing in ways that are suboptimal, the wounds closing too cleanly, or the damaged tissue regenerating without the proper levels of corruption, requiring the surgeon's intervention to ensure that the healing process produces the correct outcome. The surgeon works with a calm, methodical precision that would not be out of place in any imperial hospital, although the nature of his work would have him burned at the stake by the Inquisition. And he examines his patients with instruments that probe not just the physical, but the spiritual, devices that can detect the flow of Nurgle's power through a corrupted body and identify areas where that flow is blocked or diminished. He prescribes treatments that are part pharmaceutical and part ritual, combinations of injected disease strains and whispered prayers that together produce effects that neither could achieve alone. And he keeps meticulous records, detailed case files on every plague marine under his care, tracking the progression of their diseases and the evolution of their mutations with the same careful, longitudinal documentation that an imperial physician might use to track a chronic illness. The gene seed operations, when they are necessary, are conducted with particular gravity. The gene seed of a Death Guard plague marine is a precious thing, a biological artifact that carries not just the genetic legacy of Mortarion, but the accumulated corruption of 10,000 years of service to Nurgle. When a plague marine falls in battle and his gene seed is recovered, it is brought to the surgeon's chamber for processing and storage, a procedure that is as much ritual as surgery. The gene seed is extracted with the narthecium, examined under the surgeon's specialized equipment, and stored in containment vessels that are themselves living organisms, biological capsules that nourish and protect the gene seed, while simultaneously infusing it with additional corruption that will be passed on to the next warrior who receives it. The cycle continues, the legacy endures, and with each generation, the Death Guard move a little further from what they once were and a little closer to whatever they are becoming. Let us now turn our attention to the Tallyman, a figure we have mentioned only in passing, but whose role aboard the Plague Voidship is far more significant than his modest title might suggest. The Tallyman is the accountant of the Death Guard, the bean counter, the keeper of the ledger. In a war band that worships the god of entropy, the Tallyman represents the paradoxical desire for order within chaos, the need to impose meaning and structure on a universe that is, by the Grandfather's own design, slowly sliding toward dissolution. The Tallyman carries a massive book, a tome of cracked leather and mouldering pages that he consults constantly, scratching entries with a stylus made from sharpened bone and ink made from, well, you probably do not want to know what the ink is made from. In this book, the Tallyman records everything: kills made and worlds infected, plagues distributed and diseases cultivated, resources consumed and resources acquired, prayers offered and blessings received. The Tallyman counts and counts and counts, and in his counting, he echoes the behavior of Nurgle's demonic servants, the plague bearers, those solemn, one-eyed daemons whose eternal task is to count the innumerable diseases of the Grandfather's realm. During the night cycle, the Tallyman can often be found in his personal chamber, a small, cluttered space that is filled with scrolls and data slates, and the teetering stacks of previous ledgers that he has filled over the centuries. And he works by the light of a single bioluminescent growth that he has cultivated specifically for its steady, unwavering glow, a light source that does not flicker or shift, and that allows him to write his tiny, precise characters without straining his eyes. The scratching of his stylus on parchment is a sound that carries through the walls of his chamber and into the corridor beyond, a rhythmic, repetitive sound that has become as much a part of the ship's ambient noise as the hum of the engines or the breathing of the walls. The Tallyman's records are not mere bookkeeping, they are prophecy. By tracking the patterns in his data, the Tallyman can identify trends and trajectories that would be invisible to anyone who did not have access to centuries of accumulated records. And he can predict when a particular plague will reach its peak virulence and begin to decline. He can calculate the optimal timing for an attack based on the readiness of the ship's plague reserves and the predicted state of the target world's defenses. He can even, on occasion, detect the influence of Nurgle's will in the numbers themselves, patterns of 7 that recur in the data with a frequency that is too consistent to be coincidence. The sacred number of the plague god appearing in the kill tallies and the infection rates and the casualty counts like a divine signature scrawled across the ledger of creation. The Tallyman reports directly to the Chaos Lord, providing regular briefings on the state of the ship and the progress of the campaign. These briefings are dry, factual, stripped of emotion or opinion, at nothing but numbers and projections and the cold, hard mathematics of biological warfare. The Chaos Lord values this input above almost all others, because in a universe of deception and illusion and the constant, maddening uncertainty of war, the Tallyman's numbers are the closest thing to objective truth that anyone aboard the Plague Voidship can access. There is one more thing to discuss before our night aboard this vessel is truly complete: the matter of time. Because time on a Plague Voidship does not behave the way that time behaves in the rest of the galaxy, and this fact has consequences that are both practical and deeply philosophical. The warp does not respect the linear progression of time. When a ship enters the Imperium, as it enters a realm where cause and effect are not guaranteed to follow each other in the order that the laws of physics demand, where a journey that feels like days to the crew might take years in the real universe, or where years of subjective experience might compress into a single objective moment. Imperial navigators are trained to compensate for these temporal distortions, guiding their ships along currents that minimize the discrepancy between subjective and objective time. But even the best navigator cannot eliminate the distortions entirely, and the uncertainty that this creates is a constant source of anxiety for the crews of Imperial vessels. For the crew of a Plague Voidship, the temporal distortions of the warp are not a source of anxiety, but a source of something almost like comfort. What the Death Guard have been traveling through the warp for 10,000 years, and in that time, they have become accustomed to the fluid, non-linear nature of time in the Imperium. They do not measure their existence in days and years the way that Imperial citizens do. They measure it in cycles and campaigns, in plagues cultivated and worlds corrupted, in the slow, steady accumulation of experience and disease that marks their progression along the path that Nurgle has laid out for them. A single night on a Plague Voidship might last 8 hours or 8 days or 8 years by Imperial reckoning. It does not matter. What matters is the cycle, the rhythm, the eternal rotation of activity and rest, of war and preparation, of creation and destruction. That gives shape and meaning to an existence that might otherwise dissolve into the formless eternity of the warp. For the mortal crew, the temporal distortions are more problematic. Humans are creatures of time in a way that Plague Marines are not. Their biological clocks, still ticking, even as their bodies are transformed by disease. Their minds still trying to impose a linear narrative on an experience that refuses to be linearized. The mortal crew members age, although the rate of their aging is unpredictable, accelerated in some cases by the diseases that ravage their bodies and retarded in others by the preservative effects of Nurgle's blessing. Some crew members who have been aboard for what feels like a few years are biologically ancient, their cells ravaged by a combination of disease and temporal acceleration. Others who have been aboard for what feels like decades are still relatively young, their bodies preserved by the strange alchemy of warp time and Nurgle's favor. This temporal uncertainty gives life aboard the Plague Voidship a dreamlike quality, a sense of disconnection from the normal flow of reality that contributes to the slow erosion of the crew's resistance to Nurgle's influence. When you cannot be certain how long you have been aboard the ship, when you cannot know whether the world you were taken from still exists or has been dead for centuries, when the very concept of before and after becomes meaningless in the face of the warp's temporal chaos, the idea of returning to your previous life becomes increasingly abstract, increasingly impossible, increasingly pointless. And in the void left by the death of that hope, Nurgle's acceptance fills the space with a warmth and a certainty that is, in its way, more real and more reliable than anything the linear universe of the Imperium can offer. This, then, is the final secret of the night cycle on a Plague Voidship. It is not just a period of reduced activity, a time when the ship and its crew rest and recharge for the next cycle of war and worship. It is a microcosm of the larger experience of service aboard the vessel, a compressed version of the journey that every soul on the ship is taking, from resistance to acceptance, from despair to peace, from the bright, clean, ordered world of the Imperium to the dark, warm, organic world of Nurgle's embrace. The night cycle is where the transformation happens, not in the dramatic, visible way of a body succumbing to disease, but in the subtle, yet internal way of a mind letting go of the last threads of its former existence and allowing itself to be woven into the larger web of the ship's collective consciousness. Every night, aboard every plague voidship in the galaxy, this transformation is happening. Thousands of minds, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, are slowly, imperceptibly, inevitably being drawn deeper into the embrace of the plague god. They dream his dreams. They breathe his air. They eat his food and drink his water and pray his prayers. And with every cycle that passes, they become a little more his and a little less their own. It is the slowest conquest in the galaxy, slower even than the grinding advance of a Death Guard siege, and it is the most complete. Because when Nurgle claims a soul, he claims it utterly. There is no resistance, there is no escape, but there is only acceptance, and the peace that acceptance brings, and the slow, beautiful, terrible transformation that follows. The plague voidship sails on. The night cycle ends. The bells toll. The engines roar. The plague marines don their armor and take up their weapons and prepare for another day of the long war, the 10,000-year campaign against the Imperium that shows no sign of ending and no sign of being lost. The mortal crew shuffles to their stations, coughing and scratching and muttering prayers. The Nurglings scamper through the corridors, leaving trails of slime and chaos in their wake. The Biologus Putrefier checks his cultures. The Tallyman updates his ledger. The Plague Surgeon tends his patients. The Dark Mechanicum adepts commune with the engines. The Chaos Lord surveys his domain from the bridge, and his ancient eyes reading the tactical displays with the practiced ease of a warrior who has been doing this since before the Imperium was born. And somewhere in the deep holds, in the forgotten spaces where the ship's oldest organic growth pulses with a light that comes from nowhere and means everything, something stirs, something shifts, something grows, just a fraction of a millimeter in a direction that no one is watching. The ship is changing. The ship is always changing. And one day, perhaps not soon but inevitably, the change will be complete, and the thing that was once a vessel of the Emperor's own fleet will have become something entirely new, something that is not a ship at all, but a creature, a living, breathing, thinking creature of disease and corruption and the boundless, terrible love of Nurgle, a sailing through the void with the patience of a cancer and the purpose of a prayer. That day is not today, but it is coming, and the ship can wait. There is one chamber we have deliberately avoided until now, a chamber that even the Death Guard approach with a certain wariness, a certain reluctance that borders on unease. This is the Navigator's Sanctum, or rather, the thing that serves the same function as a Navigator's Sanctum, because the being that guides this ship through the warp is not a navigator in any sense that the Imperium would recognize. On an Imperial vessel, the navigator is a mutant, a being born with the gene that gives them a third eye capable of perceiving the currents of the warp and guiding a ship through that nightmarish realm. Navigators are simultaneously revered and feared, essential to the functioning of the Imperium's interstellar infrastructure, but so deeply touched by mutation that they are kept isolated from the rest of the crew, sequestered in sanctums that are shielded from both the warp and from the gaze of ordinary humans who might be driven mad by the sight of the navigator's true form. The navigator's sanctum on an Imperial vessel is a place of profound loneliness, a sealed chamber where a single mutant human sits in darkness, staring into the raw stuff of the immaterium, searching for the Astronomican's guiding light amid the storms and predators that inhabit the space between spaces. On a plague voidship, the navigator's sanctum has been transformed into something that defies easy description. The original chamber is still there, its reinforced walls and psychic shielding largely intact. but the interior has been so thoroughly colonized by the ship's organic growth that it more closely resembles a cave in some subterranean ecosystem than a room on a starship. Thick curtains of fungal matter hang from the ceiling, their surfaces glistening with moisture that drips steadily into pools on the floor. The walls are covered in a dense carpet of organic material that pulses with its own bioluminescence, casting the entire chamber in a shifting, multicolored glow that seems to respond to the psychic emanations of the chamber's sole occupant. The being that sits at the center of this organic cave was once a navigator. The third eye is still there, open and staring, but the face that surrounds it has been so altered by Nurgle's blessings that it barely registers as human. The body beneath the face has been similarly transformed, fused with the organic growth that fills the chamber so completely that it is impossible to tell where the navigator ends and the ship begins. Tubes and tendrils of biological matter connect the navigator to the walls, to the floor, to the ceiling, forming a network that channels the navigator's psychic perceptions directly into the ship's organic infrastructure, allowing the entire vessel to feel the currents of the warp in the same way that a fish feels the currents of a river. The navigator does not speak, has not spoken in centuries, possibly millennia. Communication with the bridge is achieved through the organic network, psychic impressions that are translated into navigational data by the ship's biological systems and displayed on the corrupted holodisplays for the Chaos Lord and his officers to interpret. Now, the navigator's perceptions are not limited to the visual, the way an Imperial navigator perceives the warp primarily through the third eye. The Plague navigator perceives the warp through every nerve ending, every cell, every molecule of the vast organic network that connects it to the ship. It can feel the texture of the warp currents, the temperature of the psychic eddies, the taste of the energies that flow around and through the vessel. And because the ship's organic systems filter the navigator's perceptions through Nurgle's influence, the warp appears to the navigator not as the terrifying maelstrom that Imperial navigators must navigate with such care, but as a warm, welcoming ocean of organic matter, thick with the nutrients and energies of the garden, are flowing in patterns that the navigator can read with the effortless intuition of a creature that has spent its entire transformed existence immersed in those flows. During the night cycle, the navigator's sanctum is the quietest place on the ship. The organic growth that fills the chamber absorbs sound with remarkable efficiency, creating a pocket of silence that is almost absolute. The only sound is the steady drip of moisture from the ceiling and the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the biological network that connects the navigator to the vessel. Visiting the sanctum during the night cycle, which very few beings aboard the ship ever do, is like stepping into a world that exists outside of time, a place where the constant noise and activity of the ship has been replaced by a stillness that is profound and, in its way, deeply unsettling. Because the stillness is not empty. It is full of the navigator's awareness, of the vast, patient consciousness that sits at the center of the web and perceives the universe in ways that no other being on the ship can comprehend. The navigator is perhaps the closest thing to a metaphor for the ship itself, a being that was once human, that was once part of the Imperium's great machine, that has been so thoroughly transformed by its long exposure to Nurgle's influence that it has become something entirely new, something that exists on the boundary between the material and the immaterial, between the living and the mechanical, between the human and the divine. The navigator does not think of itself as a prisoner or a slave. It does not think of itself at all, not in the way that human beings think of themselves. It simply is. That it perceives, it guides, it serves. And in its service, it has found a peace that would be incomprehensible to its former kin in the great navigator houses of the Imperium. A peace that comes from the complete surrender of individual identity to a larger purpose. Let us also consider briefly the Plague Voidship's relationship with the broader fleet, and the larger structure of the Death Guard. Because a plague voidship does not operate in isolation. It is part of a fleet, and the fleet is part of a plague company, and the plague company is part of the Death Guard Legion, which answers ultimately to Mortarion, the demon primarch, the lord of the Death Guard, who sits upon his throne on the plague planet, deep within the Eye of Terror, and directs the affairs of his legion through the warp itself. Or the fleet that a plague voidship belongs to typically consists of several vessels of varying sizes, from escort-class ships that serve as scouts and skirmishers, to the massive capital ships that anchor the fleet's battle line. The plague voidship we have been exploring tonight is a mid-range vessel large enough to carry a significant force of plague marines and their attendant war machines, but not as massive as the great flagships like the Terminus Est, Typhus's legendary plague barge, which is so massive and so saturated with Nurgle's corruption that it functions as a minor warp entity in its own right. During the night cycle, the fleet maintains formation through a combination of conventional sensor tracking and the organic communication network that links all plague ships in a given formation. The ships can sense each other's presence through the warp, their organic systems detecting the psychic signatures of their fellow vessels, the way animals in a herd detect each other's presence through scent and sound. This organic communication is not as precise as the Vox transmissions and sensor contacts that supplement it, but it is more reliable in many ways, unaffected by electronic interference or warp storms that might disrupt conventional communications. The fleet moves through the void as a single organism, each ship a cell in a larger body, each one connected to the others by bonds that are as much biological as technological. On the bridge during the night cycle, the watch officer monitors the fleet's formation through displays that combine conventional sensor data with the organic readings from the ship's biological communication network. The relative positions of the other ships in the fleet are displayed as glowing nodes on a three-dimensional map that is projected from the holo display, each node pulsing with a color that indicates the condition of the ship it represents. Green for healthy, yellow for damaged, red for critical. The colors are an ironic echo of the medical triage systems used in Imperial hospitals, repurposed here to assess the health of vessels that would be considered terminally ill by any Imperial standard. The fleet communication during the night cycle is sparse but constant. Short bursts of encrypted Vox traffic carry routine status reports between the ships, while the organic network conveys the subtler, harder-to-define information that helps the fleet's commanders maintain their awareness of the overall situation. Changes in the warp currents, shifts in the psychic weather that might indicate approaching threats or opportunities. The distant, barely perceptible echoes of psychic transmissions from the plague planet that carry Mortarion's will across the vast distances of the galaxy, like the scent of disease carried on a cosmic wind. Occasionally, during the quiet hours, the fleet will receive new orders. These orders come through the warp, transmitted from the plague planet, by means that are part psychic and part demonic. Messages that arrive not as words or images, but as compulsions, urges, are inclinations that the fleet's commanders interpret through a combination of experience and intuition. A sudden desire to change course, a burning need to investigate a particular system, an irresistible pull toward a specific world that the commander has never heard of, but that somehow feels essential, feels right, feels like home. These compulsions are Mortarion's commands, filtered through the warp and received by the organic networks of the plague ships, and they are obeyed with the same unquestioning loyalty that the Death Guard have shown their Primarch since the days before the heresy, when Mortarion led them from the poisoned hell of Barbarus into the stars, and told them that they would never have to be afraid again. The irony of that promise is not lost on the Death Guard, although they would never say so out loud. Mortarion promised them freedom from fear, and Nurgle delivered on that promise in a way that Mortarion could never have anticipated. The Death Guard do not fear. They cannot fear. The diseases that saturate their bodies and the blessings that sustain their souls have burned the capacity for fear out of them as thoroughly as the destroyer plague burned away their original appearance. They walk through horrors that would break the minds of lesser beings, and they feel nothing but the steady, unshakable calm of warriors who know that nothing in the universe can do to them what has not already been done. They are beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond doubt. And in that state of perfect diseased equanimity, they serve their Primarch and their God with a devotion that is absolute and eternal. But during the night cycle, and in the quiet hours, when the ship is at its most still and its most reflective, there are moments when even the Death Guard seem to remember what it was like to be something other than what they are now. Not fear exactly, not regret, but something that exists in the space between those emotions, a quiet awareness of distance traveled and things left behind, of a time when the galaxy was young and full of promise, and the future held something other than endless, grinding war. These moments pass quickly, subsumed by the weight of 10,000 years of commitment and the warm, encompassing presence of Nurgle's love. But they happen. Even aboard a plague void ship, in the heart of corruption, in the depths of the void, they happen. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing about the Death Guard. Not their bodies, and which have been transformed beyond recognition. Not their minds, which have been shaped by millennia of warfare and worship, into something that bears only a superficial resemblance to the consciousness of a normal human being. But this capacity, buried deep beneath layers of disease and devotion, and the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of service, to remember, to look back, to wonder, if only for a moment, what might have been. The night cycle continues. The ship sails on. And in the darkness between the stars, where no one can see, and no one can hear, and no one can judge, a plague marine stands at a viewing port and looks out at the void, and for just a moment, he remembers what the stars looked like before the heresy, when they were bright and clean and full of promise, and the future stretched out before him like a road with no end. Then the moment passes. The plague marine turns away from the viewing port. He returns to his quarters. He checks his weapons. He prays his prayers. And when the bells toll and the night cycle ends and the ship wakes to begin another day of the long war, he is ready. He is always ready. That is what 10,000 years of service buys you. Not peace, not happiness, not freedom, but readiness. The certainty that whatever comes next, whatever horror or wonder or catastrophe the universe has in store, you will be there to face it. You will endure it. You will survive it. And you will keep going, one step at a time, one battle at a time, one night at a time, until the stars themselves burn out and the universe finally achieves the state of perfect entropy that Nurgle has been working towards since the beginning of time. The Death Guard can wait. They have been waiting for 10,000 years. What is one more night? There is another dimension to life aboard the Plague Voidship that we have only briefly touched upon, and it is a dimension that becomes especially pronounced during the quiet hours of the night cycle. This is the dimension of memory, of history, of the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of existence pressed into the walls and floors, and organic growth of a vessel that has been continuously inhabited for longer than most civilizations manage to endure. Every plague voidship has a history, and that history is not recorded in the clean, organized archives of an Imperial vessel. It is recorded in the ship itself, in the layers of organic growth that cover the interior like geological strata, each layer representing a different era in the ship's long existence, each one carrying within its biological structure a chemical record of the diseases that were prevalent at the time of its formation, the crew that was aboard, even the emotions and experiences that permeated the atmosphere during that period. The biologous putrefiers have learned to read these layers the way a geologist reads the strata of a cliff face, extracting samples and analyzing their composition to reconstruct events that happened centuries or millennia in the past. It is an imperfect science, more art than methodology, but it has yielded insights that no other form of record-keeping could provide. The ship remembers things. Not in the way that a human mind remembers, with specific, detailed recollections of events and conversations and faces. The ship remembers in the way that a body remembers trauma, in the patterns of growth that form around old wounds, in the chemical signatures that linger in tissues long after the original stimulus has passed, in the structural adaptations that develop in response to repeated stress and that persist even when the stress is removed. Walk through any section of the ship, and you are walking through the history of the vessel, each step taking you across ground that has been shaped by events stretching back to the Horus Heresy itself. Here, in this section of corridor, the organic growth forms a dense, scarred ridge that runs along the wall at about shoulder height. Shemos, the putrefiers who have examined it, believe that this ridge formed in response to a hull breach that occurred sometime during the second millennium after the heresy, a breach caused by an Imperial torpedo that punched through the outer hull and detonated in the corridor, killing dozens of crew members and exposing the section to hard vacuum for the time it took the ship's biological repair systems to seal the wound. The organic growth that grew to fill the breach carried within it the chemical signature of the explosive residue and the biological matter of the crew who died, and over the subsequent centuries, it hardened and thickened into the ridge that exists today, a scar on the body of the ship that commemorates an event that no living being on board can remember. There, while in that chamber that was once a storage hold and is now a nurgling warren, the walls are covered in a pattern of bioluminescence that is more complex and more vivid than anywhere else on the ship. The pattern emerged several centuries ago, according to the analysis of the surrounding growth layers, and no one is entirely certain what caused it. Some of the Death Guard believe that the chamber was once used for a particularly significant ritual, a summoning or a binding, or some other act of profound psychic significance that left its mark on the ship's biological infrastructure. Others believe that the pattern is the result of a natural process, a particularly virulent strain of the bioluminescent organism that colonizes the ship's interior, finding perfect conditions in this specific chamber and flourishing beyond its normal limits. And a few, the ones who have been aboard the longest and who have seen the most, believe that the pattern is the ship itself, expressing something through the only medium available to it, a thought or a feeling or a memory rendered in light and color because it has no other way to communicate. The ship's age is a constant presence during the night cycle, when the ambient noise drops and the older, deeper sounds of the vessel become audible. The creaking and groaning that permeate the corridors during the quiet hours are not just the sounds of thermal expansion and contraction, although they are that too. They are the sounds of a structure that has been under continuous stress for 10 millennia. A frame that has been warped and bent and broken and repaired and rewarped so many times that its original configuration is nothing but a distant memory encoded in the deepest layers of its biological record. The ship flexes and shifts as it moves through the void, its organic components absorbing and distributing the stresses that would have torn a purely mechanical vessel apart centuries ago. And each flex, each shift, produces a sound that is unique to that specific moment and that specific combination of forces. A voice that speaks of age and endurance, and the stubborn refusal to break. That is the defining characteristic of everything associated with Nurgle. The oldest section of the ship, the core around which everything else has been built and rebuilt over the millennia, is located deep in the vessel's interior, and protected by layers of newer construction and organic growth that have accumulated like sediment around a buried fossil. This core contains the ship's original reactor housing, a massive structure of adamantium and ceramite that was forged in the shipyards of Luna before the Great Crusade and that has been continuously in service ever since. The core is almost entirely encased in organic growth, its original surfaces visible only in a few places where the biological material has been deliberately cleared away by the Dark Mechanicum adepts who maintain the reactor. In these cleared patches, you can see the original metal, scarred and pitted, but still structurally sound, still bearing faint traces of the aquilus and identification markings that were engraved on it when it left the shipyard all those thousands of years ago. Touching this metal, feeling its cold, hard surface beneath the warmth and softness of the organic growth that surrounds it, is a strange experience. It is a connection to a time when the ship was new, when it sailed under the Emperor's banner, when the Death Guard who crewed it were loyal servants of a dream that had not yet been shattered. That metal has been to places and seen things that no one alive can remember. It was there when the Primarchs walked among their sons. It was there when the Great Crusade pushed the borders of the Imperium to the very edge of the galaxy. It was there when Horus raised his hand against the Emperor, and the universe cracked apart along fault lines that no one had known existed. And it is still there, buried beneath 10,000 years of corruption and organic growth, and a silent witness to everything that has happened since, carrying within its molecular structure a record of stresses and temperatures and radiation exposures that tells the story of the ship's entire existence in a language that only the metal itself can speak. During the night cycle, when the ship is at its quietest and its oldest, there are moments when the connection between the ship's present and its past seems to thin, when the accumulated weight of 10 millennia of existence presses close to the surface, and the ghosts of the ship's former selves seem almost visible in the dim bioluminescence of the corridors. The Death Guard do not speak of these moments often, but they are aware of them. They feel the ship's history in their bones, in the gene seed that connects them to the warriors who first crewed this vessel, and in the diseases that have been evolving and adapting within the ship's biological ecosystem since the moment Nurgle's power first took hold. For the Death Guard, the ship is not just a vehicle, it is an ancestor, a patriarch, the oldest living member of a family that spans 10,000 years and that has no intention of dying anytime soon. Let us also consider the social dynamics that play out among the mortal crew during the night cycle, because these dynamics are more complex and more interesting than the simple master-slave relationship that might be assumed from the outside. The mortal crew of a plague voidship is not a monolithic group, it is a society. Yet with all the hierarchies and alliances and rivalries and friendships that any society develops, when a large number of beings are forced to live and work together in close proximity for extended periods. At the top of the mortal hierarchy, as we have discussed, are the Nurgle cultists, the true believers who serve aboard the ship voluntarily and who occupy positions of authority and influence among the mortal crew. But within the cultist community itself, there are further divisions and distinctions. There are the priests, who lead the worship services and who claim to have a direct line of communication with the Grandfather through their prayers and their diseases. There are the overseers, who manage the work gangs and the labor details, using a combination of religious authority and physical intimidation to keep the pressed crew in line. There are the healers, and that term is used very loosely, who administer the ship's version of medical care to the mortal crew, dispensing diseases and blessings in equal measure, according to a logic that makes sense only within the framework of Nurgle's faith. And there are the scribes, the literate members of the cult, who maintain the mortal crew's records and who correspond with the tallyman, providing the data that feeds his endless calculations. Below the cultists are the skilled workers, mortal crew members who have survived long enough aboard the ship to develop expertise in specific areas of maintenance or operation. These are the pipe fitters and the wire runners and the fluid handlers and the dozen other specialist trades that keep the ship's mechanical systems functioning alongside its organic ones. Skilled workers occupy a privileged position in the mortal hierarchy, not because the cultists or the Death Guard have any particular regard for their well-being, but because their skills are difficult to replace. A skilled pipe fitter who knows the quirks of a particular section of the ship's fluid circulation system is more valuable alive than dead, and this practical consideration translates into slightly better rations, slightly better quarters, and a slightly longer life expectancy than the unskilled laborers who make up the bulk of the crew. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the press-ganged laborers, the most recently captured, and the most recently pressed into service. These unfortunates do the hardest, most dangerous, most degrading work on the ship. The work that no one else will do because it involves exposure to levels of corruption that would kill even a seasoned crew member in short order. They clean the drainage channels in the crew decks, wading through ankle-deep slurries of biological waste that burns their skin and seeps into their pores. They maintain the exteriors of the demon engines in the deep holds, working in close proximity to machines that radiate psychic malice with every pulse of their corrupted power systems. They haul supplies through corridors that are so thick with organic growth that the passage must be literally cut through with machetes and then sealed behind them as the growth closes back in. Their life expectancy is measured in weeks or months rather than years, and they know it. They know that they are expendable, or that the ship will consume them as surely as it consumes everything else, and that their only hope of survival is to work hard enough and last long enough to be promoted into the ranks of the skilled workers, where the corruption is slower and the death is less immediate. During the night cycle, the social dynamics of the mortal crew shift and change in ways that the cultists and the Death Guard are only dimly aware of. Small acts of kindness pass between crew members in the darkness, shared rations and whispered words of encouragement, and the simple human comfort of physical proximity in a universe that has become overwhelmingly hostile. Friendships form between people who, in their previous lives, would have had nothing in common. Are bonds that are forged in the shared experience of suffering, and that are as strong and as real as any relationship that exists in the bright, clean world of the Imperium. Stories are told, whispered from bunk to bunk during the quiet hours. Stories of the worlds the crew members came from, of the families they left behind, of the lives they lived before the plague ship claimed them. These stories are precious. They are the last connection to a reality that is slipping away, the last evidence that the person telling them was once something other than what they have become. And as the months and years pass, and the diseases progress, and the memories fade, the stories change. They become less specific, less detailed, less connected to any particular place or person. They become myths, legends, fairy tales told in the dark by people who can no longer quite remember whether the things they are describing ever really happened, or whether they are simply stories they heard from someone else, passed down through the crew like folk tales through a culture that has no written records. This is the human experience of the plague Voidship, not the grand narrative of gods and demons and 10,000-year wars, but the small, intimate, infinitely sad story of ordinary people trying to survive in an environment that is actively trying to consume them. It is a story that plays out every night, in every bunk and every corridor and every workshop on the ship, and it is, in its way, the most important story on the entire vessel. Because the Death Guard, for all their power and their age and their terrible purpose, are not what makes the plague Voidship run. The mortal crew makes it run. The pipe fitters and the wire runners and the fluid handlers and the laborers and the cultists and the scribes and all the thousands of other human beings who go about their work and their worship and their slow, quiet dying, day after day and night after night, keeping the engines burning and the corridors clear and the plagues tended and the prayers flowing, in service to a cause that most of them did not choose and none of them fully understand. They are the heart of the plague Voidship, not the reactor and not the chapel and not the bridge. They are these broken, diseased, transformed, diminished human beings who have been reduced to components in a machine that serves a god who loves them in a way that is worse than hatred. But they are the fuel that burns in the engine, the blood that flows through the veins, the breath that fills the lungs. Without them, the plague Voidship is nothing but a corroded hull drifting through the void. With them, it is alive and hungry and patient and terrible and beautiful in the way that only something that has been perfectly designed for its purpose can be beautiful. And during the night cycle, when the activity dims and the quiet hours descend and the ship settles into its rhythm of organic sounds and bioluminescent pulses, these ordinary, extraordinary human beings lie in their bunks and listen to the heartbeat of the vessel that has become their world. They listen, and they breathe, and they dream. And then in their dreams, they walk through gardens that should not exist and feel the warmth of a sun that has never shone on any world in the material universe. And when they wake, they rise, and they go to their stations, and they do their work, and they pray their prayers, and they wait for the night to come again. Because the night always comes. On a plague voidship, in the void between the stars, the night always comes. And in the darkness, Grandfather Nurgle smiles. That is what a single night on a plague voidship is like. It is not what you expected, perhaps. It is not the screaming, mindless chaos that the Imperial propaganda machines would have you believe. It is something stranger and, in its way, more disturbing. It is a functioning society, a living organism.
It's a community of beings who have found meaning and purpose in the embrace of the very thing that the rest of the galaxy fears most. It is a monument to the power of faith, even faith in something terrible. It is proof that life finds a way, even when that way leads through fields of plague and gardens of decay and the slow, patient corruption of everything that was once whole and clean and good. And it is, above all else, a reminder of what waits for the Imperium if it ever falters, if the Emperor's light ever dims, if the walls of faith and technology and sheer stubborn human endurance that have kept the darkness at bay for 10,000 years ever crack and crumble and fall. Because the plague voidships are out there, right now, cutting through the warp with the patience of a cancer and the inevitability of the grave.
Why, they are always out there, and they are never in a hurry, because they know, with the absolute certainty that only the truly faithful can know, that time is on their side, that decay wins in the end, that everything eventually rots. And in the grim darkness of the far future, aboard a ship that breathes and bleeds and dreams, the night cycle ends and the war goes on. Now, before we close out this deep dive into one of the most disturbing corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, let us take a moment to think about what we have seen tonight. We have walked through corridors that breathe. We have stood on bridges where 10,000-year-old warriors plot the downfall of worlds with the calm efficiency of accountants balancing a ledger. We have visited laboratories where disease is not fought but cultivated, whilst where plague is not an affliction but an art form, where the boundary between creator and creation has been dissolved by 10 millennia of devotion to a god who sees beauty in the breakdown of all things. We have descended into holds where demon engines dream of slaughter and nurglings play their endless, cackling games. We have prayed in a chapel where the incense is spores and the wine is plague, where the hymns are droned in voices that are part human and part something that should never have existed. We have looked through viewing ports into a realm of impossible color and terrible beauty, and we have seen, reflected in that alien landscape, the face of a god who smiles upon his children with a love that is as genuine as it is devastating. We have spent a single night on a plague voidship, and we have survived. Whether or not that survival is a mercy is a question that Nurgle himself might find amusing. The Death Guard have sailed the stars for 10,000 years. They were among the first legions created, among the first to be unleashed upon a galaxy that did not know what was coming, and among the first to be claimed by the powers that lurk beyond the veil of reality. They have seen empires rise and fall. They have watched stars be born and die. They have fought in every major conflict that has shaped the galaxy since the Horus Heresy, and they will continue to fight in every major conflict that shapes it for the next 10,000 years and beyond. Their plague ships are their homes, their workshops, their temples, and their gardens. They are the most terrifying vessels in the galaxy, not because of the weapons they carry, although those weapons are fearsome indeed, but because of what they represent. They represent the end, the final destination, the place where all things go
when the fight is over and the resistance has crumbled, and there is nothing left but the slow, quiet, peaceful surrender to the inevitable. In the Imperium, they tell their children to pray to the Emperor for protection. They tell them that faith is a shield, that duty is a weapon, that the light of the golden throne will keep the darkness at bay forever. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps faith is enough. Perhaps duty and sacrifice, and the sheer, bloody-minded refusal to give in, will be enough to hold back the tide for another 10,000 years, another 100,000, another million. But somewhere out in the void, as in the space between the stars where the warp bleeds through and reality wears thin, a plague ship is sailing. Its hull breathes, its corridors pulse, its crew prays. Its master sits upon a throne of corroded metal and watches the stars with eyes that have seen everything the universe has to offer and found all of it wanting. And it is patient. It is so patient. Because in the end, everything rots. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the horrifying reality of life aboard a plague void ship, I would love it if you would hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps more than you know, and it means I get to keep making these kinds of videos for you. If you have thoughts on what topic you would like me to cover next, drop them in the comments below. Your suggestions are what keep this channel going, and there is so much more of this universe left to explore together. Until next time, stay safe out there. The void is dark, and it is full of things that should not be. But as long as we stick together, we will be fine. Probably. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.